You have been arguing with reality for longer than you realize. Every time life did not match your plans, every time pain arrived uninvited, every time people disappointed you, and every time the past refused to become different in your memory, something inside you kept fighting what had already happened. But if that fight could bring peace, why does the mind still feel so tired? Why do you still feel restless, tense, and trapped inside thoughts that never seem to end? The truth is, the mind does not grow quiet when life obeys you. It grows quiet when you stop resisting what is. And this is one of the deepest teachings in Buddhism. Acceptance is not weakness, it is freedom. It is the end of inner struggle, the end of arguing with moments you cannot change, and the beginning of a peace that does not depend on everything going your way. Tonight, as you listen, something inside you will begin to soften. The pressure to control everything will start to fade. The noise in your head will begin to settle, and you may feel a deep stillness rising where tension used to live. When you wake up tomorrow, you may see your life differently, with more space in your heart, more steadiness in your mind, and more peace in the face of what is. This is not just another talk to fall asleep to. This is the moment the inner argument begins to end. Are you ready? Let's begin. The moment the inner argument begins to fade, something unexpected comes into view. Not peace yet, not silence yet, but clarity. A quiet realization that much of the weight carried for so long did not come from life itself, but from the way the mind responded to it. And as that realization deepens, one question naturally rises to the surface. What if the suffering was never just in what happened, but in the refusal to let it be? A subtle tension lives in the background of almost every difficult moment. It is not always loud. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it disguises itself as thinking, analyzing, or trying to make sense of things. But underneath it all, there is a quiet resistance, a small but constant push against reality as it is. Pain arrives in many forms: a harsh word, an unexpected ending, a loss that leaves an empty space, a plan that collapses without warning. These moments carry their own natural weight. There is a sting, a heaviness, a human response that does not need to be explained or justified. This is the first layer, the simple experience of pain. But almost immediately, something else begins. The mind steps in, not to hold the experience gently, but to question it, to reject it, to argue with it. Thoughts begin to form around the event. This should not have happened. This is wrong. This is not how things were supposed to be. Why did this happen to me? How do I undo this? And just like that, a second layer is added. Not pain, but resistance to pain. Not the event itself, but the refusal to accept that the event has already taken place. This second layer is often invisible, yet it carries most of the suffering. It turns a single moment into an ongoing struggle. It keeps the experience alive long after it has passed. It transforms something temporary into something that feels permanent. The mind believes it is protecting something important. It believes that by resisting, it is maintaining control, preserving dignity, or defending what should have been. But in reality, it is doing something very different. It is holding on to a moment that cannot be changed and creating tension around it again and again. This is how suffering multiplies. A person may experience disappointment once, but the mind replays it 100 times. Each replay carries the same emotional charge, sometimes even stronger than before. The body responds as if the event is happening again. The heart tightens, the breath becomes shallow, and the nervous system remains on edge. All of this from something that is no longer happening. This is not because the event was so powerful, it is because the mind refuses to let it be complete. There is a quiet misunderstanding here. The mind assumes that if it stops resisting, it is giving up, agreeing, or approving of what happened. It believes that acceptance means weakness or defeat, so it keeps fighting, thinking that this fight is necessary. But acceptance is not agreement. It is not approval. It is not saying that what happened was right or fair. It is simply recognizing that it has already happened. There is nothing left to fight. When this is seen clearly, even for a brief moment, something begins to shift. The grip of resistance loosens just slightly. The mind pauses, no longer pushing against what cannot be moved. And in that pause, there is space. This space is unfamiliar at first. It may feel empty, almost uncomfortable, because the mind is used to being busy, used to engaging, used to reacting, but within this space, something important becomes possible. The experience can be felt without being resisted. Pain can exist without turning into suffering. This does not mean the pain disappears. It means it is no longer being amplified. It is allowed to move through, to rise and fall naturally, without interference, like a wave that is no longer being pushed back into the ocean. There is a softness in this way of relating to experience, a gentleness that does not try to control or manipulate what is already present. It does not add extra weight. It does not create additional tension. It simply allows. This allowing is not passive. It requires awareness. It requires the ability to notice when resistance begins, to recognize the thoughts that are forming, and to see them for what they are. Not truth, not solutions, but reactions. The mind says, this should not be happening, but that is not a fact. It is a preference. The mind says, this is wrong, but that is not reality. It is judgment. The mind says, I cannot accept this. But the truth is, it is already being experienced. Acceptance is not something that needs to be forced. It is something that is already present beneath the resistance. What is being resisted is already here. And when resistance drops, even slightly, what remains is the simple fact of the moment. Not good, not bad, just present. This is where quiet begins, not because everything is resolved, not because life has become easier, but because the extra layer has been removed. The argument has ended. There is no longer a need to convince reality to be different. There is no longer a need to replay the past or anticipate a different version of the present. There is only what is here now. And in that simplicity, the mind finds rest. This rest is not something that can be achieved through effort. It is not something that can be forced or manufactured. It arises naturally when resistance is no longer being maintained. It is what remains when the struggle stops. There is a deep relief in realizing that the mind does not have to fix everything, that it does not have to solve every problem or correct every situation, that it can simply observe, feel, and allow. This does not mean action is never taken. It means action comes from clarity, not from resistance. When the mind is no longer caught in objection, it sees more clearly. It responds more wisely. It moves with the situation instead of against it. But before any of that happens, there must be a willingness to see the pattern, to notice how often resistance arises, to notice how quickly the mind labels something as wrong, to notice how much energy is spent trying to mentally rewrite what has already happened. This noticing is the beginning of freedom, not because it changes the past, but because it changes the relationship to the past. The event remains the same, but the suffering begins to dissolve. There is no longer a need to carry it forward. It can be left where it belongs. And in that leaving, something new becomes possible. A lightness that was not there before. A quiet that does not depend on circumstances. A sense of being at ease, even in the presence of difficulty. This is not something reserved for special moments or ideal conditions. It is available in every moment, even the uncomfortable ones, especially the uncomfortable ones. Because it is in those moments that resistance is most visible. It is in those moments that the mind reveals its habit of objection, and it is in those moments that acceptance can be practiced, not as an idea, but as a direct experience. The breath is felt, the body is noticed, the thoughts are seen but not followed. The moment is allowed to be exactly as it is, and slowly the mind begins to learn something new. It begins to learn that it does not have to fight everything, that it does not have to react to every discomfort, that it can simply be present. This learning does not happen overnight. It is a gradual process, a gentle unfolding. There will be moments of resistance, moments of frustration, moments when the old patterns return. But each time awareness is brought to the process, each time resistance is seen instead of blindly followed, the pattern weakens, and the quiet grows stronger. Until one day, something that once caused great disturbance is met with a different response. Not indifference, not suppression, but calm presence. The event happens, the feeling arises, but there is no argument. And without the argument, the suffering does not take root. It passes, like everything else, leaving behind a sense of space, a sense of ease, a reminder that the mind does not have to create extra weight, that it can let things be, that it can rest. And in that rest, something profound is discovered. Peace was never something that needed to be chased. It was always here, waiting beneath the resistance, waiting for the moment the mind finally stops saying no to what already is, and simply allows reality to be. When the mind stops fighting what is already here, a deeper truth begins to appear. The pain was not only in the event, it was also in the hope that reality might still bend to personal desire. And once that is seen, another layer opens. Life does not ask what the ego wanted first. There is a quiet struggle that shapes much of human suffering, and most people do not even notice it while it is happening. On the surface, it looks like disappointment, frustration, resentment, or grief. But underneath all of these, something simpler is taking place. Life is unfolding one way, and the mind is insisting it should have unfolded another. This is the silent conflict between reality and preference. Reality is what is. It is the fact that something happened, that someone changed, that time moved, that a plan failed, that a season ended, that a body aged, that a door closed. Preference is the inner voice that says, no, it should have gone differently. It should have stayed. It should have worked. They should have understood. I should have been chosen. I should not have lost this. This should not be my life. That voice is so common that many people mistake it for intelligence. They think they are thinking clearly because they can explain why reality is wrong. But Buddhism invites a deeper look. It asks a painful but liberating question. What if reality is not the one refusing peace? What if the mind is the one refusing to stop arguing? The ego does not like this question because the ego survives through preference. It creates an identity around what it wants, what it rejects, what it expected, and what it believes it deserved. It does not simply respond to life. It builds a private version of life and then suffers when the world refuses to match it. This is why two people can live through similar events and respond in completely different ways. One feels the sting of what happened and slowly adjusts. The other becomes trapped in inner conflict, not because the event was objectively worse, but because the mind keeps comparing what happened to what it wanted to happen. The comparison becomes a wound. A relationship ends and the pain is real. But then preference steps in and says it was supposed to last. A job is lost, and fear rises naturally. But then the ego says this was supposed to be the secure path. A loved one changes, becomes distant, chooses something else, and sadness appears. But then the mind adds, they were supposed to stay who I needed them to be. And just like that, suffering deepens. What makes this difficult to see is that preference often feels innocent. It seems normal to want life to go a certain way. It seems natural to have hopes, plans, and desires. Buddhism does not say these are evil. It does not say a human being must become cold, detached, or empty. It simply shows that when preference hardens into demand, peace disappears. There is a difference between having a wish and making reality answer to that wish. There is a difference between longing for a certain outcome and quietly believing that life has failed because it delivered something else. The first is human. The second is the beginning of inner war. Reality does not negotiate with personal preference, not because life is cruel, but because life is not organized around the ego's script. Rain falls on the day that was meant to be sunny. People misunderstand the words that were spoken with care. The body gets tired when the mind wanted it to remain strong. The person once loved with certainty becomes a stranger. The future imagined for years dissolves in a single afternoon. None of this asks for permission. None of it pauses to ask whether the heart is ready. This can feel harsh until a deeper truth becomes visible. Reality is not punishing anyone. It is simply moving according to causes and conditions far larger than one person's preference. The river does not change direction because someone wanted dry ground. Winter does not apologize to the trees for taking the leaves. Time does not stop because someone finally found a moment they wanted to keep forever. The mind suffers because it keeps asking life to be personal. It says, "Why is this happening to me?" as if reality singled it out. It says, "This is unfair," as if existence promised custom-made outcomes. It says, "I did everything right," as if life were a machine that always dispenses reward when the correct buttons are pressed. But reality is not a transaction. It is not a servant to preference. It is not an employee of the ego. And the sooner this is understood, the sooner a different kind of peace becomes possible. This peace is not built on getting everything wanted. It is built on no longer needing reality to obey inner demand before the heart can rest. This is one of the most humbling teachings in Buddhism because it confronts a very deep habit. Most people do not just experience life. They negotiate with it internally all day long. They bargain with the present. They resist the past. They fear the future because it may not match their plans. Even while nothing dramatic is happening, the mind remains busy measuring reality against preference. This creates endless tension. A person wakes up and already the comparison begins. The day should feel lighter. The body should not be this tired. The message should have arrived by now. That person should be more loving. I should be more advanced by this age. My life should look different. My mind should be more peaceful by now. These thoughts may seem small, but each one is a refusal of the present. Each one quietly says this moment is unacceptable unless it changes. And because life rarely matches preference exactly, the mind remains restless. Many people believe they are disturbed by events, but often they are disturbed by the difference between what is happening and what they thought should be happening. The event may be simple. The suffering comes from the internal protest. This protest can hide beneath ambition as well. A person may believe they are driven, focused, and determined, but underneath, there may be a silent inability to be with life as it is. They do not simply work toward change. They reject the present so deeply that their entire nervous system is built around escape. This is why even achievements do not always bring peace. The ego says, "Once I get there, I will rest." But when there is another challenge, another unmet preference, another version of life that should be happening instead, the struggle begins again. The mind that cannot accept this moment will not be satisfied by the next one. It will only move the argument forward. A person can spend years thinking the problem is outside, when the real disturbance is the inability to let this moment exist without complaint. This does not mean one should never improve life. Buddhism is not teaching passivity, it is teaching clarity. It is showing that right action becomes distorted when it grows out of resistance. When the mind acts from pure objection, it cannot see clearly. It becomes reactive, bitter, and impatient. But when reality is first accepted as it is, action becomes wiser. The person no longer wastes energy denying the facts. They begin from truth. That is where freedom starts. A doctor cannot treat an illness that is denied. A person cannot clean a room while pretending it is already tidy. A heart cannot heal while insisting it was never wounded. In the same way, a human being cannot move wisely through life while arguing with the facts of their own experience. First, there must be honesty. This is what is here. This is what happened. This is what I feel. This person is not who I wanted them to be. This season is not the one I would have chosen. This loss has already occurred. This body is changing. This plan is over. This is the truth now. There is a strange peace in such honesty, not because it feels pleasant, but because the exhausting performance of denial begins to stop. The mind no longer has to keep inventing alternative worlds where reality behaved better, and that performance is exhausting. Many people are tired not because life is unbearable, but because they are trying to carry two worlds at once, the real one and the imaginary one that should have replaced it. The real world demands attention, patience, and courage. The imaginary world demands endless thought, complaint, blame, and fantasy. The mind keeps stepping between them, unable to commit to either. That is why it becomes so drained. Reality asks only to be seen. Preference asks to be obeyed. One brings clarity, the other brings conflict. The ego has many reasons for clinging to preference. Sometimes it thinks that if it lets go of what should have happened, it will lose its standards. Sometimes it fears that acceptance will make it weak. Sometimes it believes that inner protest proves that it cared. If it stops resisting, maybe the loss will seem smaller, the betrayal less important, the dream less meaningful. But this is another misunderstanding. Acceptance does not erase meaning. It does not reduce the value of what was loved. It does not say the dream was foolish or the pain was unnecessary. It only says that fighting reality will not bring back what is gone, and demanding a different past will not create peace in the present. The Buddha's teaching often points toward the chain that creates suffering. Contact happens, feeling arises, then craving or aversion appears. From there, clinging grows, and the mind becomes trapped. Preference is often the form clinging takes. The mind does not simply notice what it likes or dislikes. It grasps, it rejects, it personalizes. It builds identity around what must stay and what must never happen. Then life changes, as it always does, and the ego feels betrayed. But life did not betray anyone. Life simply moved. This is why impermanence is such an essential part of acceptance. If everything changes, then preference can never be made into a throne. The person loved today may think differently tomorrow. The body trusted in youth will not feel the same in old age. The job, the house, the role, the image, the certainty, the plan, all of it is passing through changing conditions. The mind suffers because it wants temporary things to obey permanent expectations. It wants flow to become fixed. It wants changing people to become stable guarantees. It wants uncertain life to become a predictable contract. But reality does not sign that contract. When this is deeply understood, something inside begins to loosen. The person stops acting shocked that life changes. They stop treating uncertainty as a personal insult. They stop expecting people to be permanent shelters from impermanent conditions. They still care, they still love, they still hope. But they no longer build peace on the demand that life must remain arranged according to preference. This is a huge shift. It means joy becomes more sincere because it is no longer based on ownership. It means grief becomes cleaner because it is no longer mixed with argument. It means action becomes clearer because it begins from what is true, not from what the ego wishes were true. The mind grows quieter here, not because all desire disappears, but because demand weakens. A person can still prefer health to sickness, honesty to betrayal, success to failure, reunion to separation. But preference remains light. It does not become a weapon used against reality. It does not turn every unwanted moment into a moral outrage. This lightness is wisdom. It says, "This is not what I wanted, but it is what is here." That sentence alone can change a life, because it ends the fantasy that inner peace depends on universal compliance from the world. It breaks the hidden belief that the universe must line up with private preference before calm is allowed. So much suffering comes from postponing peace. I will be okay when this changes. I will rest when they understand me. I will soften when life becomes fair. I will accept myself when the outcome confirms my worth. I will trust when nothing uncertain remains. But that day never comes. There is always another imperfection, another delay, another person acting outside the script, another reminder that life does not negotiate with preference. This could sound hopeless, but it is actually liberating. If peace depended on control, almost no one would ever know it. If calm required perfect conditions, the heart would remain a hostage forever. The good news is that peace does not come from training life to obey. It comes from training the mind to stop arguing with what is already true. This does not happen by force. The ego cannot be bullied into surrender. It softens through seeing, through repeated honesty, through noticing how every inner demand creates contraction, through realizing that reality never lost the argument because it was never arguing. Only the mind was, and the mind can stop, not all at once, not dramatically, but gradually, gently, through practice. A difficult event happens. The old reflex says this should not be. Awareness notices it. A breath enters. A small pause appears. Instead of feeding the protest, the person sees the preference beneath it. I wanted something else. That is all. The pain may remain, but the war begins to fade. That is a sacred moment, because it means consciousness has stepped in where habit used to rule. It means the person is no longer fully trapped inside egoic demand. It means truth is being allowed to stand on its own without immediate correction. And from there, so much becomes possible. Compassion becomes possible because the person is no longer busy accusing life. Patience becomes possible because not every delay is treated as an offense. Forgiveness becomes possible because reality is no longer filtered entirely through wounded preference. Even grief becomes more tender because the mind stops turning sorrow into resistance. This is why acceptance is not resignation. It is liberation from unnecessary conflict. Resignation says nothing matters. Acceptance says this is what is here and now I can meet it clearly. Resignation is lifeless. Acceptance is alive, alert, responsive, and deeply honest. It is the difference between collapsing and bowing. One is defeat, the other is wisdom. Bowing to reality does not mean worshipping pain. It means recognizing fact before fantasy. It means allowing truth to be the ground from which life is lived. It means saying yes to the existence of what is here, even if the heart still needs time to process it. And that time matters. Acceptance is not always immediate. Sometimes the nervous system trembles before it softens. Sometimes the heart resists because it is afraid of what truth will require. Sometimes the mind returns again and again to the same preference because it has built identity around it. This is natural. Buddhism does not ask for harshness. It asks for awareness. Notice the preference. Notice the protest. Notice the suffering that grows when life is measured against what should have been. Then, little by little, let the measuring stop. Let this moment be what it is before deciding what it means. Let the person be who they are before building a case against them in the mind. Let the loss be real before turning it into a permanent identity. Let the day be disappointing without turning it into proof that life is against you. These are not small shifts. They are doorways to freedom. The person who stops demanding that reality match preference does not become cold. They become spacious. They become less easily shattered because they are no longer leaning on fragile arrangements for inner stability. They stop asking impermanent things to carry permanent peace. That is maturity. The child mind says, "I will be calm when the world behaves." The awakened mind says, "I will meet the world as it is." One remains dependent, the other becomes free, and that freedom is quiet. It does not need to prove itself. It does not arrive with fanfare. It appears slowly in the ordinary moments where resistance used to rise and now softens instead. In the instant where disappointment is felt but not dramatized. In the conversation where another person's behavior is seen clearly without being turned into a personal attack. In the silent recognition that life has its own movement and the ego is not its master. This recognition humbles the heart, but it also relaxes it. Reality was never required to become different before peace could begin. The struggle was only maintained by the belief that it was. Once that belief weakens, the mind starts to rest. It no longer treats preference like law. It no longer builds a courtroom around every unwanted event. It no longer spends its strength demanding another version of the past, the present, or the future. It sees, it allows, it responds when needed. And it slowly learns one of the rarest forms of peace, the peace of no longer requiring life to be other than it is before the heart permits itself to be still. When the mind finally begins to loosen its grip on how things should have been, another truth quietly reveals itself. The struggle was never only about preference, it was also about time, about what has already happened and the strange effort to keep fighting it long after it is over. Something inside refuses to let certain moments end. There is a particular kind of tiredness that does not come from the body. It does not come from long hours, heavy work, or lack of sleep. It comes from thinking, from returning to the same memory again and again, not to understand it, but to argue with it. A moment passes in reality, but it continues in the mind. A conversation that ended hours ago replays with new responses. Words that were spoken cannot be taken back, yet the mind rearranges them, edits them, replaces them, as if the right version might somehow reach backward through time. A decision that led to an unwanted outcome is revisited endlessly, not to learn, but to undo. A mistake becomes a loop. A loss becomes a story that refuses to close. The body is here, in the present, but the mind is somewhere else, standing inside a past that no longer exists, trying to correct what is already complete. This is the exhaustion of resisting what has already occurred. It is subtle at first. It feels like thinking, like processing, like trying to make sense of things, but slowly it becomes something heavier. The same thoughts repeat, the same emotions return, the same tension builds in the chest, the shoulders, the breath. Nothing new is being created, nothing is being resolved. Yet the mind continues as if something is still unfinished. The strange part is that the event itself is no longer happening. The situation has ended, the words have been spoken, the outcome has already formed, but the mind does not accept this fully. It behaves as if the moment is, still open, as if it can still be changed. This is where energy begins to drain, because the mind is working on something that cannot respond. It is like speaking into an empty room and waiting for an answer, like knocking on a door that no longer exists, like trying to reshape water that has already flowed past your hands. There is effort, but no movement, and over time, this effort becomes fatigue. People often say they are tired of life, but many are tired of their own resistance to what has already happened. They are not only carrying the event, they are carrying the ongoing attempt to undo it. This attempt shows itself in different ways. Sometimes it appears as regret. The mind says, "I should have done this differently. I should have seen it sooner. I should have known better." And each time this thought returns, it creates a fresh wave of discomfort, as if the mistake is happening again in the present. Sometimes it appears as resentment. The mind says, "They should not have treated me that way. This should not have happened to me," and the feeling becomes anchored to a moment that is no longer alive, yet still has power because it is being replayed. Sometimes it appears as longing. The mind reaches for a version of the past that felt better, safer, more complete. It returns there again and again, comparing it to the present, creating a constant sense of loss. In all of these forms, the pattern is the same. The mind does not accept that the moment is over. It keeps returning, as if it might still be open. But reality has already closed that chapter. This is one of the hardest things for the mind to understand, not intellectually, but emotionally. It can recognize that something has happened, but it struggles to allow that something to be finished. And so it keeps the moment alive internally. This is why some experiences feel like they never end, not because they are still happening, but because they are still being held. Buddhist teaching points gently to this. It does not ask the mind to forget. It does not demand that memory disappear. It simply invites a different relationship with what has already occurred. Instead of replaying the moment to change it, the mind begins to see it as complete. This is what happened. This sentence has a quiet power. It does not argue, it does not judge, it does not add or remove anything. It simply acknowledges the fact that the event has already taken place. And within that acknowledgement, something begins to release. The mind stops leaning forward into the past, trying to push it into a different shape. It begins to settle. This does not mean that emotion disappears. The body may still feel the impact. Sadness may still arise. Discomfort may still be present. But without the constant mental replay, the experience becomes lighter. It is no longer being fed. This is where the difference between pain and suffering becomes clear again. Pain may come from what happened. Suffering comes from keeping it alive through resistance. When the mind stops replaying, the event is allowed to move into the past where it belongs. It no longer occupies the present in the same way. There is space again. This space is unfamiliar at first because the mind is used to filling it. It is used to returning to the same thoughts, the same stories, the same arguments. When that pattern begins to slow, there is a kind of emptiness. But this emptiness is not a problem. It is the beginning of rest. The nervous system begins to settle. The breath becomes deeper. The body no longer reacts as if something is constantly wrong. The mind starts to recognize that not every thought needs to be followed. This recognition changes everything, because once it is seen that replaying does not change the past, the habit begins to weaken. The mind may still return to the event, but there is awareness now. There is a quiet understanding that this is a pattern, not a solution. And with that awareness, a choice becomes possible. The thought appears. The memory arises. But instead of entering it completely, the mind notices it. It sees the urge to replay. It sees the desire to fix. And instead of following, it allows the thought to pass. This is not suppression. It is not avoidance. It is clarity. It is the recognition that the moment is already complete. And continuing to engage with it in this way only creates more tension. Over time, this practice becomes more natural. The mind learns that it does not have to return to every memory with the same intensity. It begins to trust that letting go does not mean losing something important. It means freeing itself from unnecessary repetition. There is also a deeper layer to this exhaustion. The mind is not only replaying events to change them. Sometimes it is replaying them to protect identity. A person may hold on to a painful moment because it confirms a belief. I was wronged. I was not valued. I failed. I am not enough. The replay becomes a way of reinforcing this identity, and letting go feels like losing that identity. This is why the pattern can be difficult to break. It is not just about the event. It is about the story built around the event. Buddhist teaching gently invites the person to look at this story, not to destroy it, but to see it clearly. To notice how the mind keeps returning, not because the moment is unfinished, but because something inside has become attached to it. This attachment keeps the past alive, and with it the exhaustion continues. But when the story is seen for what it is, a construction, a pattern, a habit, it begins to loosen. The person no longer needs to keep proving the same point. They no longer need to return to the same moment to confirm the same identity. They begin to allow the past to be just that, past. This is not forgetting, it is releasing. The memory may remain, but it is no longer charged in the same way. It no longer pulls the mind back with the same force. It becomes something that was experienced, not something that is still happening. And in that shift, energy returns. The mind is no longer occupied with endless repetition. It is available again. Available for the present moment. Available for what is actually here. This is where life begins to feel different. Not because the past has changed, but because the relationship to it has changed. The person is no longer carrying it in the same way. There is more space, more clarity, more rest. This rest is not passive. It is active in its own quiet way. It allows the person to respond to life with fresh awareness instead of reacting from old patterns. It allows new experiences to be seen without being filtered through past resistance. It allows the heart to open again, because it is no longer busy holding on to what cannot be undone. There is a deep kindness in this, a kindness toward oneself. To stop forcing the mind to solve what cannot be solved. To stop asking it to rewrite what cannot be rewritten. To allow it to rest. This does not happen all at once. There will be moments when the mind returns to the old habit, moments when the replay feels automatic. But each time it is noticed, each time there is even a small pause, the pattern weakens. And over time, the mind learns a new way of being, a way that does not rely on constant correction of the past, a way that allows what has happened to remain where it belongs, a way that does not carry unnecessary weight. This is where quiet deepens. Not because life becomes simpler, but because the mind is no longer adding extra layers. It is no longer arguing with what has already been decided by reality. It is no longer exhausting itself trying to undo what cannot be undone. It begins to trust the present again. And in that trust, something very simple but very powerful becomes possible. The mind rests, not because everything is resolved, but because it has finally stopped trying to resolve what is already complete. And in that rest, there is a kind of peace that does not depend on changing the past, a peace that comes from letting it be. As the mind begins to loosen its grip on the past, a deeper resistance often appears, quieter but more stubborn. It is not just about what happened anymore, it is about what accepting it might mean. And somewhere inside, a fear rises. If I accept this, does it mean I agree with it? There is a quiet hesitation that keeps many people stuck. They begin to understand that resistance is exhausting, that replaying the past brings no relief, that arguing with reality only deepens suffering. And yet, something inside refuses to let go completely. Because acceptance feels dangerous. It feels like surrendering to something that was unfair. It feels like approving of something that hurt. It feels like giving up on what should have been different. And so the mind pulls back. It says, I cannot accept this, because accepting it would mean I am okay with it. This is one of the most important misunderstandings on the path of inner peace. Acceptance is not agreement. Acceptance is not approval. Acceptance is not saying that what happened was right or fair or deserved. Acceptance is simply the recognition that something has already taken place. Nothing more, nothing less. It is the willingness to see reality as it is, without adding a layer of denial on top of it. A person can accept that a storm has arrived without liking the storm. They can accept that a relationship has ended without agreeing that it should have ended. They can accept that someone acted wrongly without approving of their behavior. Acceptance does not erase judgment. It does not erase values. It does not erase clarity about what is right or wrong. It only removes the internal struggle against what is already real. This distinction changes everything, because much of the resistance in the mind comes from this confusion. The mind believes that if it lets go of the fight, it will lose its sense of justice. It believes that if it stops arguing, it will become passive, weak, or indifferent. But the opposite is true. When the mind stops resisting reality, it becomes clearer. It sees more accurately. It responds more wisely. Resistance clouds perception. It distorts what is seen. It mixes emotion with fact. It creates urgency where there may be none. It creates confusion where there could be clarity. Acceptance removes that distortion. It allows the person to stand in truth, not in reaction. This is why Buddhism speaks of right view before right action. If the mind is still arguing with what is, it cannot see clearly enough to act skillfully. It is still caught in protest, but when reality is accepted, even if it is painful, the mind becomes steady. From that steadiness, action becomes precise. There is no longer a need to react out of anger or fear. There is space to choose. This is where acceptance becomes powerful, not as a passive state, but as a foundation for wise response. A person who accepts that something has happened can decide what to do next. A person who is still resisting remains stuck in the moment, unable to move forward. This can be seen clearly in difficult situations. Someone is treated unfairly. The mind reacts immediately. This should not have happened. This is wrong. This is unacceptable. These thoughts may be true in a moral sense, but they do not change the fact that the event has already occurred. If the person remains in resistance, they stay trapped in that moment. Their energy is consumed by the argument. But if the person accepts that it has happened, something shifts. There is still clarity that it was wrong. There is still a sense of what is just. But the mind is no longer fighting the fact itself. It is free to respond. It can set boundaries. It can speak up. It can walk away. It can take action. All of this becomes possible only after acceptance. Without acceptance, action is reactive. With acceptance, action is intentional. This is the difference between being driven by emotion and being guided by clarity. Many people fear that acceptance means doing nothing, but acceptance does not prevent action. It refines it. It removes unnecessary struggle so that necessary movement can happen. A person standing in quicksand does not escape by fighting the sand. They escape by understanding it. They stop struggling in the wrong way so they can move in the right way. In the same way, the mind must stop resisting reality before it can respond effectively. There is also a deeper emotional layer to this teaching. Acceptance often feels like letting go of a certain kind of control. The mind wants to hold on to the idea that things could still be different if it just tries hard enough. If I keep thinking about it, maybe it will change. If I keep feeling this strongly, maybe it will mean something. If I keep holding on, maybe I will not lose what I had. But acceptance gently reveals that control was never there in the way the mind imagined. It shows that reality has already moved, and holding on does not bring it back. This can feel like loss, because it is. It is the loss of the illusion that the past can be controlled. It is the loss of the belief that resistance has power. It is the loss of the identity that was built around fighting what happened. And for a moment, this loss can feel heavy. But beneath it, there is something else. Relief. The relief of no longer having to carry something that cannot be changed. The relief of no longer having to maintain an internal argument. The relief of no longer needing reality to be different before peace can begin. This relief is quiet. It does not announce itself loudly. It appears as a softening, a loosening, a gentle shift in how the moment is held. There is still awareness of what happened, there is still sensitivity, there is still care, but there is no longer resistance. This is where the mind begins to rest. Not because everything is resolved, but because the inner conflict has ended, and from this place something new becomes possible: understanding, compassion, even forgiveness. Not forced, not demanded, but arising naturally when the mind is no longer consumed by opposition. This is why acceptance is not denial. It does not pretend that pain is not there. It does not ignore what is difficult. It meets it fully. It allows the experience to be seen clearly, without distortion. And in that clarity, healing begins. Denial says, "This did not happen." Resistance says, "This should not have happened." Acceptance says, "This has happened." Only one of these allows the mind to move forward. The others keep it stuck. There is also a strength in acceptance that is often overlooked. It takes courage to face reality without turning away. It takes honesty to admit what is true, even when it is uncomfortable. It takes patience to allow the moment to be what it is, without rushing to change it. This is not weakness. It is discipline. It is maturity. It is a form of inner stability that does not depend on external conditions. A person who can accept reality is not easily shaken, because they are not relying on life to meet their expectations in order to feel okay. They have learned to meet life as it is. This does not mean they stop caring. It means they care without attachment to a specific outcome. They act without needing immediate results. They remain open without being broken by change. This is a different way of living, one that is not based on control, but on understanding. One that is not driven by resistance, but by clarity. One that does not require life to be perfect in order to feel at peace. This way of living becomes more natural with practice. Each time the mind notices resistance, there is an opportunity to pause, to breathe, to see what is actually here, to allow it. Not because it is liked, not because it is approved, but because it is real. And reality does not need permission to exist. Over time, this practice builds a quiet confidence. The person begins to trust that they can face whatever arises, not by controlling it, but by meeting it. This trust changes the way life is experienced. There is less fear of what might happen, less tension around what is happening, less attachment to what has happened, because the mind is no longer trying to fight everything. It is learning to stand with what is. This is where true peace begins, not in perfect conditions, not in ideal outcomes, but in the absence of inner conflict. And that conflict ends the moment acceptance is understood correctly, not as agreement, not as approval, but as the simple, honest recognition of what is already here. And in that recognition, the mind grows quiet again, not because it has solved everything, but because it has stopped arguing with what cannot be changed. And in that silence there is space, space for clarity, space for action, space for healing, space for life to move without resistance. As the mind begins to understand that acceptance is not agreement, something deeper starts to come into view. Even when the truth is clear, even when the heart knows that fighting reality only creates more suffering, there is still a voice that refuses to let go, a quiet but persistent voice that keeps saying the same thing in different ways. This should not be. It appears so quickly that most people never question it. A moment unfolds, something uncomfortable happens, and before awareness has time to settle, the mind reacts. Not just with feeling, but with rejection. This is wrong. This should not be happening. This is not how things are supposed to be. At first, it feels natural. It feels justified. It feels like a reasonable response to something unwanted. But when this pattern is observed more closely, something surprising is revealed. It is not just a reaction. It is a habit. And more than that, it is an identity. The ego, in its subtle way, becomes attached to opposition. It does not only experience discomfort, it builds a sense of self around resisting what is. This is where the phrase, "this should not be," becomes more than a thought. It becomes a position, a stance, a way of existing in the world. The ego begins to define itself through what it rejects. It says, "I am the one who knows how things should be. I am the one who recognizes what is wrong. I am the one who stands against what should not exist." At first glance, this can seem like strength. It can feel like clarity, like having standards, like refusing to settle for less. But underneath, something else is happening. The mind is becoming dependent on resistance. It begins to need something to oppose in order to feel certain of itself. Without something to reject, it feels uncertain. Without something to label as wrong, it feels empty. Without something to push against, it does not know who it is. This is the addiction, not to pain itself, but to the identity that forms around resisting pain. The phrase, "this should not be," becomes a constant background signal. It arises in large situations and small ones. It appears when plans change, when people behave differently, when the body feels discomfort, when emotions arise that are not welcome, and each time it appears, it reinforces the same pattern. Something is wrong, something must be corrected, something must be different before peace can exist. This pattern keeps the mind in a state of tension because life is always changing, always imperfect, always moving in ways that do not match expectation. And as long as the mind continues to say, "this should not be," to what is already happening, it remains in conflict. This conflict becomes familiar, so familiar that it begins to feel normal. A person may wake up already feeling that something is off, not because something specific has gone wrong, but because the mind is already scanning for what does not match its idea of how things should be. The room is not arranged perfectly. The body feels slightly tired. The day ahead does not look ideal. Someone behaves in an unexpected way, and immediately the thought appears. This should not be. This is not how it should feel. This is not how things should go. These may seem like small reactions, but they accumulate. They create a constant friction with the present moment. And over time, this friction becomes exhaustion. Not because life is unbearable, but because the mind is constantly resisting what is already here. The ego rarely questions this pattern. It assumes it is necessary. It believes that if it stops resisting, it will lose control, lose identity, lose direction. But what it does not see is that this constant opposition is the very thing creating instability. It is like trying to stand firmly on shifting ground while continuously pushing against it. There is no balance in that. The deeper teaching begins when this pattern is seen clearly, not judged, not suppressed, but noticed. The moment the thought arises, "this should not be," awareness gently steps in. It does not argue with the thought. It does not try to force it away. It simply sees it. This is a thought. This is a reaction. This is the mind trying to reshape reality. And in that seeing, something begins to loosen. The thought loses some of its authority. It is no longer treated as truth. It is seen as a habit. This is where quiet begins. Not because the thought disappears immediately, but because the mind is no longer fully identified with it. There is space between awareness and reaction. Within that space, something new becomes possible. The moment can be experienced without immediate rejection. The sensation can be felt without being labeled as wrong. The event can unfold without being turned into a problem that must be fixed. This does not mean everything becomes pleasant. It means everything becomes allowed. And in that allowing, tension begins to dissolve. There is a subtle shift from opposition to observation. Instead of saying, "this should not be," the mind begins to say, "this is what is here. This shift may seem small, but it changes the entire experience. Because the first statement creates conflict, the second creates space. In that space, the body relaxes, the breath deepens, the mind softens. There is no longer a need to immediately correct or reject the moment. There is only a quiet presence. This presence is not passive. It is aware. It sees clearly what is happening without adding extra layers of resistance, and from that clarity, a different kind of response emerges. If action is needed, it comes from understanding, not from reaction. If change is possible, it happens without tension. If something must be addressed, it is done with steadiness. But none of this requires the mind to declare that reality is unacceptable. It simply requires seeing what is true. This is where the ego begins to lose its grip, because its identity is built on opposition. It thrives on saying no to what is. It gains strength from labeling, judging, rejecting. When that pattern is no longer fed, the ego softens. It does not disappear completely, but it becomes quieter, less dominant, less reactive. And in that quieting, something deeper becomes visible. A sense of being that is not dependent on constant correction, a stability that does not come from controlling every outcome, a peace that does not require life to match a specific image. This is not something that can be forced. It unfolds gradually. Each time the pattern is noticed, each time the thought, "this should not be," is seen instead of believed, the habit weakens. Each time the moment is allowed to exist without immediate rejection, the mind becomes more at ease. Over time, this changes the way life is experienced. There is less urgency to fix everything, less pressure to make every moment conform to expectation, less need to control what cannot be controlled. There is more openness, more patience, more willingness to be with what is. This does not mean the person stops caring. It means they care without resistance. They respond without needing to reject. They move through life without constantly pushing against it. This creates a different kind of strength, a quiet strength, one that does not rely on constant tension, one that is not easily shaken by change, one that remains steady even when things do not go as planned, because it is not built on the demand that things must go a certain way. It is built on the ability to meet things as they are. This ability is rare, not because it is difficult to understand, but because it requires a shift in identity. The ego must loosen its attachment to being the one who knows what should be. It must release its need to constantly oppose. It must allow reality to exist without immediate correction. This can feel uncomfortable at first, because the ego feels like it is losing something. And in a way, it is. It is losing its habit of control, its habit of resistance, its habit of defining itself through opposition. But what is gained is far greater. A sense of ease, a sense of clarity, a sense of quiet that does not depend on external conditions. This quiet is not empty, it is full of awareness, full of presence, full of life as it is, without distortion. And in that fullness, something very simple becomes clear. The moment was never the problem, the resistance was. And when the resistance fades, even slightly, the mind begins to rest. Not because everything is perfect, but because it no longer needs everything to be perfect. It no longer needs to say, "this should not be," in order to feel stable. It no longer needs to fight reality in order to feel in control. It begins to trust, not in a specific outcome, but in its ability to meet whatever arises. This trust changes everything, because it removes the need for constant opposition. It removes the need to correct every imperfection. It removes the belief that peace depends on the world matching an internal image. And in that removal, the mind becomes quiet. Not through effort, not through force, but through understanding, through seeing the pattern clearly, through recognizing that the habit of saying, "this should not be," is not protecting anything. It is only creating tension. And once that is seen, even for a moment, the habit begins to dissolve, the mind begins to soften, and in that softness there is space. Space for the moment to be, space for the breath to move, space for life to unfold without resistance. And in that space, something very simple but very powerful begins to emerge. A quiet that does not come from control, a peace that does not depend on preference, a way of being that no longer needs to argue with what is already here. And in that, the mind finally begins to rest. As the habit of saying, "this should not be," begins to loosen, another force quietly reveals itself beneath it. The mind may stop openly rejecting reality, yet something subtler continues to disturb its peace. It is no longer loud resistance, but a constant pull, a quiet wanting for things to be different than they are. And that wanting never seems to rest. There is a subtle tension that lives inside desire, not the simple wish for something to happen, but the deeper insistence that it must happen in a certain way, at a certain time, or not at all. This is where craving begins to shape the experience of the present moment. The mind does not simply observe what is here, it measures it against what it wants. This moment is too slow, this situation is taking too long, this feeling should go away, this person should act differently. This result should have already arrived. And even when nothing is clearly wrong, the mind still searches for what is missing. This is how craving creates arguments with the present. It is not always obvious. It does not always appear as strong desire. Sometimes it shows up as restlessness, as impatience, as a feeling that something is not quite right, even when everything seems fine on the surface. The mind keeps leaning forward or pulling back. It wants the future to arrive faster. It wants discomfort to leave sooner. It wants pleasure to last longer. It wants reality to adjust itself to an internal rhythm that life does not follow. And because life moves on its own terms, the mind remains in quiet conflict. This conflict is not always dramatic, but it is constant. A person sits in a moment that is calm, but the mind says, "This is not enough. Something else should be happening, something more exciting, more meaningful, more fulfilling." Or a person faces difficulty and the mind says, "This needs to end now. I cannot stay in this. This must change immediately." In both cases, the present moment is not being allowed to exist as it is. It is being compared, measured, and quietly rejected. This is the nature of craving. It is not just about wanting things. It is about wanting reality to obey that wanting. And when it does not, the mind becomes restless. This restlessness can feel like normal thinking. It can feel like motivation, like planning, like anticipation. But underneath, there is a subtle dissatisfaction that never fully settles. Even when one desire is fulfilled, another quickly takes its place. The mind reaches for something, and when it gets it, there is a brief moment of satisfaction. But that moment does not last. Soon, something else becomes necessary. Something else becomes the next condition for peace. This creates a cycle. Peace is always just ahead, just out of reach. Happiness becomes something that will arrive later, when the next condition is met. And the present moment becomes something to pass through, something to tolerate, something to improve or escape. This is why the mind rarely rests. It is always negotiating with time. It is either pulling the future closer or pushing the present away. It does not settle into what is here because it is always waiting for something else. This waiting creates tension. Even in moments of comfort, there is a subtle unease, a sense that something more is needed, a feeling that this is not enough. This is not because the moment is lacking, it is because the mind is not fully here. It is divided between what is happening and what it wishes were happening. This division is the source of inner noise. Thoughts arise not because they are necessary, but because the mind is trying to adjust reality to its desires. If things are going well, the mind worries about losing them. If things are difficult, the mind pushes against them. In both cases, there is no stillness, because stillness requires acceptance of what is, and craving does not allow that. It always adds a condition. I will be at peace when this changes. I will be calm when this arrives. I will be happy when this is resolved. These statements may seem harmless, but they quietly delay peace. They place it in the future. They make it dependent on something that has not yet happened. And because the future is uncertain, peace remains uncertain as well. This creates a fragile state of mind, one that is always dependent on external conditions, one that cannot rest unless everything aligns perfectly. But life rarely aligns perfectly, and so the mind remains unsettled. Buddhist teaching points directly to this pattern. It shows that craving is not the problem because of what it wants. It is the problem because of how it relates to the present. It does not allow the present to be complete. It always adds something missing, something needed, something that must change. This creates a constant sense of lack. Even when there is enough, it feels like there is not. Even when there is peace, it feels incomplete. Even when there is joy, it feels temporary. The mind cannot fully receive what is here because it is always reaching for something else. This reaching is exhausting. It may not feel like effort, but it drains energy over time. The nervous system remains activated, always scanning for what needs to be different. The body carries a subtle tension even in moments of rest. The breath becomes shallow. The attention becomes scattered. All of this from a simple habit, not allowing the moment to be as it is. There is a deep shift that happens when this is seen clearly, not as an idea, but as a direct experience. The moment craving arises, awareness notices it, not to judge it, not to suppress it, but to see it. The mind is wanting something else. The mind is leaning away from what is here. This seeing creates a pause, and in that pause, something becomes possible. The moment can be allowed to exist without immediately trying to change it. This is not about removing desire completely. Desire may still arise, but it is no longer followed blindly. It is no longer treated as a command that must be obeyed. It is seen as a movement of the mind, and in that seeing, it loses some of its urgency. The person no longer needs to act on it immediately. They can remain present. They can stay with the moment. This changes the entire experience, because the moment is no longer being compared to something else. It is no longer being measured against a future outcome. It is simply being experienced. This brings a different kind of satisfaction. Not the excitement of getting what is wanted, but the quiet contentment of being with what is. This contentment is not dependent on conditions. It does not require things to be perfect. It arises from the absence of inner conflict. When the mind stops pulling away from the present becomes enough. Not in a forced way, not in a way that denies desire, but in a way that allows experience to be complete as it is. This is where the mind begins to settle, not because everything is resolved, but because the need for constant adjustment fades. The moment no longer feels like something that must be improved. It becomes something that can be lived. This does not mean that goals disappear. It does not mean that change is no longer pursued. It means that action comes from clarity, not from craving. The person can still move toward what they value, but without rejecting where they are. They can work toward the future without abandoning the present. They can experience desire without being controlled by it. This creates balance. A balance between movement and stillness, between effort and ease, between intention and acceptance. In this balance, the mind finds a new rhythm, one that is not driven by constant dissatisfaction, one that does not depend on getting somewhere else in order to feel complete. This rhythm is quieter, more stable, more at peace. It allows the person to experience life more fully, to feel what is here without immediately trying to change it, to enjoy what is present without worrying about its end, to move through difficulty without rushing to escape it. This is not something that happens all at once. It develops over time. Each moment of awareness weakens the habit of craving. Each moment of presence strengthens the ability to stay. Each time the mind notices its urge to adjust reality and chooses to remain instead, something shifts. The pattern begins to change. The mind becomes less reactive, less restless, less dependent on external conditions, and more able to rest in what is. This rest is not passive. It is alive. It is aware. It is engaged without being attached. It allows life to unfold without constant interference. And in that allowing, something very simple becomes clear. The present moment is not the problem. The constant desire for it to be different is. And when that desire is seen, understood, and gently released, even for a moment, the mind grows quiet again. Not because it has everything it wants, but because it no longer needs everything to be different in order to feel at peace. And in that quiet, there is a sense of completeness. Not because life is complete, but because the mind is no longer arguing with it. And that is where true stillness begins. As the pull of craving begins to loosen, another truth quietly comes into view. The mind does not only want things to be different, it also wants them to stay the same. It clings to what feels good and resists anything that threatens to change it. And beneath that clinging, there is a silent demand. Stay like this. There is a kind of pain that does not come from losing something, but from trying to stop it from changing. A tension that arises when the mind holds onto what is naturally moving, as if it could freeze time through effort alone. People want feelings to remain steady, relationships to stay unchanged, bodies to remain strong, moments of happiness to last without interruption. The mind quietly says, "This is good, this must not change." And when change arrives, as it always does, it feels like something has gone wrong. But nothing has gone wrong. Life has simply continued its movement. This is where a deeper form of suffering begins. Not from what is taken away, but from the expectation that it should not have been taken in the first place. Not from the change itself, but from the demand that there should have been no change at all. This demand is rarely spoken out loud, but it is felt everywhere. A person finds joy, and immediately there is a subtle fear that it might end. That fear creates tension even in the presence of happiness. The mind cannot fully relax because it is already guarding against loss. A relationship feels warm, connected, alive. The mind quietly begins to depend on it staying that way. It builds a sense of safety around its continuity. And when the relationship shifts, even slightly, there is confusion, resistance, sometimes even anger. Not only because something changed, but because it was expected not to. This expectation creates inner pressure. It turns something natural into something fragile. It places a burden on people, on emotions, on circumstances, asking them to remain stable in a world that is constantly changing. This is what makes the demand for permanence feel so heavy. It is not just unrealistic, it is violent in a quiet way, not violent toward others, but toward reality itself, because it tries to force what is fluid to become fixed. It tries to make what is temporary behave as if it were permanent. And when reality refuses, the mind reacts with frustration. This is where chaos begins. The mind says, "This should not have changed. This feeling should not have faded. This person should not have become different. This moment should have lasted longer." These thoughts may seem natural, but they carry a hidden assumption that life should remain still, that once something becomes pleasant, it should stay that way, that once something feels secure, it should never shift. But this is not how life moves. Everything changes. Not occasionally, not unexpectedly, but continuously. The body changes, thoughts change, emotions rise and fall. People grow, evolve, move in different directions. Seasons pass, situations transform. Nothing remains exactly as it is. This is not a flaw in reality, it is its nature. And when this nature is not understood, the mind begins to struggle. It tries to hold on to what cannot be held. It tries to preserve what is already slipping. It tries to protect what was never meant to stay. This creates a constant sense of instability, because the mind is always trying to secure something that is inherently insecure. It builds attachments not only to things, but to how those things feel. It becomes attached to a version of a person, a version of a moment, a version of itself. And when that version changes, it feels like loss. Even if something new is emerging, even if growth is happening, even if the change is natural, the mind resists. Because it was not prepared for movement, this resistance creates tension in subtle ways. A person may notice that they are not as happy as they were before, and instead of allowing the feeling to pass naturally, the mind begins to chase the old state. It tries to recreate it, to bring it back, to hold on to something that has already moved. This effort creates frustration because the moment cannot be recreated. It was never meant to stay. In the same way, a person may feel discomfort and immediately want it to disappear. The mind says this feeling should not be here. It tries to push it away. But pushing creates resistance. And resistance gives the feeling more weight. So instead of passing, it lingers. Not because it is strong, but because it is being held in place by opposition. This is how the demand for permanence works in both directions. It clings to what is pleasant. It rejects what is unpleasant. In both cases, it refuses to allow change, and in both cases, it creates suffering. Buddhist teaching points to impermanence as a central truth, not as a concept to understand intellectually, but as something to be seen directly. Everything that arises will pass, not eventually, but continuously. Even while something is present, it is already changing. Even while a moment is happening, it is already moving. This can feel unsettling at first, because the mind wants stability. It wants something to hold on to, something that will not shift, something that will remain the same. But this desire for fixed ground is what creates the struggle, because there is no fixed ground in the way the mind imagines. There is only movement, and when this is seen clearly, something begins to change. The person stops trying to freeze what is already flowing. They stop demanding that life remains still. They begin to allow change to be part of the experience, not something to resist. This does not mean they stop caring. It means they care without clinging. They experience joy without trying to hold it. They experience sadness without trying to push it away. They allow both to come and go. This creates a different relationship with life, one that is not based on control, but on understanding. The person begins to see that trying to hold on to things does not protect them. It only creates tension. That trying to stop change does not preserve what is loved. It only distorts the experience. That trying to make something permanent does not make it more real. It only makes its loss more painful. When this is understood even slightly, something softens. The grip of the mind loosens. There is less urgency to hold, less fear of losing, less resistance to change. And in that softening, there is space. Space for things to be as they are. Space for change to unfold without conflict. Space for the moment to be experienced fully without the pressure of permanence. This space allows a deeper kind of peace. Not the peace that comes from things staying the same, but the peace that comes from no longer needing them to. This is a very different kind of stability. One that does not depend on external conditions. One that remains even as things change, because it is not built on what is outside. It is built on how the mind relates to what is outside. A person who understands impermanence does not become detached in a cold way. They become present in a deeper way. They appreciate what is here without trying to own it. They engage with life without trying to control it. They allow relationships to evolve without forcing them into fixed shapes. They allow emotions to move without identifying with them completely. This creates a sense of freedom, a freedom that does not come from having everything stay the same, but from no longer needing it to. There is also a kind of tenderness in this way of living, because when the mind stops demanding permanence, it begins to see things more clearly. It sees how precious each moment is, not because it will last forever, but because it will not. This changes the way things are experienced. A simple conversation becomes meaningful. A quiet moment becomes valuable. A connection becomes something to be felt fully, without taking it for granted, because there is no assumption that it will remain. This is not a sad realization. It is a deep one. It brings a kind of appreciation that is not based on possession, but on presence. The person no longer says, "This must stay." They say, "This is here, and that is enough." This shift removes a great deal of tension, because the mind is no longer trying to secure what cannot be secured. It is no longer fighting the natural movement of life. It is moving with it. This does not mean there will be no pain. Loss will still be felt. Change will still be experienced. But the suffering around it is different. It is not amplified by resistance. It is not made heavier by expectation. It is allowed to move, to rise and fall, to come and go, without being held in place by the demand that things should not change. This is where the mind becomes quieter, not because life becomes stable, but because the mind stops trying to make it stable. It stops asking for permanence from what is impermanent. It stops building expectations that reality cannot fulfill. And in that stopping, there is relief, a deep, quiet relief. The kind that does not come from getting what is wanted, but from no longer needing everything to stay the same in order to feel at peace. And in that relief, the mind begins to rest again, not in stillness of circumstances, but in the understanding of their movement. And that understanding becomes a foundation, one that allows life to unfold without constant resistance, one that allows change to happen without creating chaos, one that brings a quiet strength that remains, even as everything else continues to move. And in that quiet strength, something very simple becomes clear. Nothing was ever meant to stay, and once that is no longer resisted, the heart begins to open instead of holding on. As the heart begins to loosen its grip on permanence, another layer quietly reveals itself. Even when the mind understands that everything changes, there is still something that keeps it unsettled. Not because life is unstable, but because something inside remains unfinished. And that unfinished feeling refuses to stay quiet. There is a certain kind of noise that does not come from the outside world. It is not created by people, situations, or circumstances. It is created by something incomplete within. A subtle pull, a lingering sense that something is missing, something unresolved, something not yet fulfilled. This is the voice of unfinished desire. It does not always speak loudly at first. Sometimes it appears as a quiet restlessness, a feeling that something is not quite right, even when everything seems fine. A sense that there is more to be done, more to be achieved, more to be experienced before peace can be allowed. The mind begins to orbit around this feeling. It returns to it again and again. It asks, what is missing? What has not yet happened? What still needs to be completed before I can finally settle? And in that questioning, the mind becomes louder. Not because the moment is lacking, but because the attention is pulled away from it. Unfinished desire has a way of stretching time. It makes the present feel like a waiting room, a place to pass through, not a place to be. The mind becomes focused on what is not here yet, on what could be, on what should happen next. And as long as that focus remains, the present moment feels incomplete, even if nothing is actually wrong. This is how inner restlessness grows. A person may be sitting in a quiet space with no immediate problems, yet the mind is busy. It is thinking about the future, replaying possibilities, imagining outcomes, planning, worrying, anticipating. Not because something needs to be done right now, but because something feels unfinished. This feeling can come from many places: a goal not yet achieved, a conversation that never happened, a relationship that did not become what it was expected to be, a version of life that has not yet arrived. Each of these creates a subtle tension, not always painful, but persistent. The mind keeps returning to it, as if holding on to it will somehow bring it closer. But this holding does not bring peace. It creates noise, because the mind cannot fully rest in what is present, while it is anchored in what is absent. This is one of the most overlooked sources of suffering, not what is happening, but what is not happening. Not the presence of pain, but the absence of something desired. This absence becomes a kind of mental gravity. It pulls attention away from the moment. It creates a constant sense of movement, even in stillness. The person feels like they are never fully here, always reaching, always waiting, always leaning towards something that has not yet arrived. This leaning creates tension, because the present moment is not being allowed to stand on its own. It is always being compared to something else, something imagined, something hoped for, something unfinished. The mind becomes loud because it is trying to close this gap. It is trying to bring the desired outcome into the present, through thinking, through planning, through imagining. But the more it tries, the more it reinforces the sense that something is missing. And so the cycle continues. The mind does not rest because it believes rest is not yet deserved. It believes peace is something that comes after completion, after achievement, after resolution. But this belief keeps peace just out of reach, because there is always something else that remains unfinished. Even when one desire is fulfilled, another appears. The mind moves from one object of longing to the next, and the sense of incompleteness never fully disappears. This is why the mind can feel busy even in moments of success. Even when things are going well, there is still a background noise, a subtle push toward what comes next, a quiet voice that says, "This is not enough. This needs to continue. This must not end. This must become more." This voice is not satisfied because it is not looking for completion. It is sustained by movement. It thrives on reaching. And as long as it is followed, the mind remains in motion, never fully arriving, never fully settling. Buddhist teaching gently points to this pattern. It shows that desire itself is not the issue. Desire arises naturally. It is part of being human. But when desire becomes something that must be fulfilled before peace can exist, it creates suffering, because peace becomes conditional. It depends on something outside the present moment, something uncertain, something that may or may not happen. And until it does, the mind remains unsettled. The deeper insight is not to remove desire, but to change the relationship with it, to see it clearly, to recognize when it is pulling attention away from what is here, to notice how it creates a sense of lack, and to understand that this sense of lack is not coming from the moment itself. It is coming from the comparison. The moment is being measured against something else, and in that measurement, it is found lacking. But what if the moment is not lacking? What if it is complete as it is? This question begins to shift the experience, not by denying desire, but by loosening its grip. The mind begins to see that it does not have to follow every longing. It does not have to chase every incomplete feeling. It can allow desire to arise without being controlled by it. This creates space between the desire and the response. In that space, something becomes possible. The moment can be experienced directly, without being filtered through what is missing, without being overshadowed by what is not yet here. This is where quiet begins to return, not because desire disappears, but because it is no longer dominating attention. The person begins to rest in what is present, even while desire exists. This is a subtle but powerful shift. It means that peace is no longer postponed. It is no longer something that waits for completion. It becomes something that is available now, in this moment, as it is. This does not mean that goals are abandoned. It means they are held lightly. They are pursued without creating inattention. They are worked toward without rejecting the present. The person can move forward without leaving the moment behind. This creates a different kind of energy, not driven by lack, not fueled by restlessness, but grounded in presence. This presence brings clarity. The mind becomes less reactive, less scattered, less pulled in different directions. It becomes more focused, more stable, more at ease, because it is no longer chasing something that is not here. It is fully engaged with what is. This engagement changes the quality of experience. Even simple moments feel different, more complete, more alive, because they are not being interrupted by constant longing. They are allowed to unfold fully, without being compared, without being judged as insufficient. This does not eliminate all discomfort. There may still be moments of wanting, moments of reaching, moments of restlessness. But these moments are seen. They are not followed blindly. They are not turned into identity. They are simply part of the experience. And because they are seen clearly, they do not take over. They pass, like everything else. This passing is important. It reminds the mind that nothing is fixed, not even desire, not even longing. They arise, they stay for a while, and they dissolve. When this is understood, the urgency around them begins to fade. The mind no longer treats them as commands. It no longer believes that they must be fulfilled immediately. It begins to trust the present more, to see that what is here is enough, not in a forced way, but in a natural way. This trust brings a sense of ease, a quiet confidence, a feeling that there is nothing missing in this moment, even if there are things that have not yet happened. This is a different way of living, one that is not driven by unfinished desire, one that is not constantly reaching for something else, one that is able to rest, right here, right now. This rest is not empty, it is full of awareness, full of presence, full of life as it is. And in that fullness, something very simple becomes clear. The mind was not loud because something was wrong. It was loud because it was chasing what was not here. And when that chasing stops, even for a moment, the noise begins to fade. The mind becomes quiet again, not because everything is complete, but because it no longer needs everything to be complete in order to feel at peace. And in that quiet, there is a sense of wholeness, not built on achievement, not dependent on fulfillment, but arising from the simple act of being fully present with what already exists. And that presence becomes enough. As the mind begins to loosen its grip on unfinished desire, something softer begins to emerge. The noise fades, the urgency slows, and yet there is still a quiet discomfort that remains. Not because something is wrong, but because something has not reached a clear ending. The mind still waits for closure. There is a quiet belief that peace comes when everything is resolved. When questions are answered, when outcomes are certain, when stories are complete. The heart keeps looking for that moment when it can finally relax, when it can say, "Now it is finished, now I can rest." But life rarely offers that kind of ending. Most experiences do not close neatly. Conversations stop without full understanding. Relationships shift without clear explanations. Efforts are made without guaranteed results. Paths are taken without knowing where they will lead. Even joy itself comes and goes without warning, leaving behind a feeling that something was left unfinished. And so the mind keeps waiting. It holds on to moments, not because they are still happening, but because they never felt complete. It replays them, not to change them, but to search for a sense of finality that was never given. This is where a subtle kind of suffering begins, not from what happened, but from the need for it to feel finished. The mind believes that without closure there can be no peace, that without resolution there can be no rest, that without a clear ending something remains open, unresolved, unsettled. But this belief creates tension, because life does not operate on perfect endings. It moves continuously, without waiting for everything to make sense. And when the mind tries to hold on to events until they feel complete, it becomes stuck. It refuses to let go, not because it cannot, but because it believes it should not. It says, "This is not over. This is not finished. I cannot move on until this makes sense." And in that holding, the moment is kept alive, not in reality, but in the mind. This is where exhaustion returns, not from effort in the present, but from carrying something that belongs to the past. A person may find themselves thinking about something long after it has ended, not because it is still relevant, but because it never felt complete. A conversation that ended abruptly, a connection that faded without explanation, a goal that was not achieved, a chapter that closed without clarity. Each of these leaves a trace, a feeling of something unfinished, and the mind tries to resolve it. It searches for answers, it tries to fill in the gaps, it builds stories to create a sense of closure, but often there are no answers, no clear endings, no perfect resolutions, and so the mind remains unsettled. This is where a deeper understanding begins to open. Peace does not come from everything being finished. Peace comes from allowing things to remain unfinished. This is a difficult truth, because it challenges a very deep habit, the habit of needing closure, the habit of wanting things to be complete before letting go. But what if completion is not required? What if the heart can rest even when something remains open? This question begins to shift the experience. It invites a different way of relating to life. Instead of holding on to events until they feel finished, the mind begins to allow them to be as they are, incomplete, unresolved, open. This does not mean ignoring them. It does not mean pretending they do not matter. It means allowing them to exist without needing to fix them. This creates space, space for the moment to be what it is, space for the past to remain in the past, space for the mind to stop searching for answers that may never come. In this space, something softens. The tension of needing closure begins to fade. The urgency to understand everything begins to slow. The mind starts to realize that it does not need to complete every story in order to move forward. It can carry the experience without carrying the need for resolution. This is where a different kind of peace appears, a quiet peace, not based on certainty, not dependent on answers, but rooted in acceptance, the acceptance that not everything will make sense, that not everything will have a clear ending, that some things will remain open, and that this is not a problem. This acceptance removes a great deal of pressure, the pressure to figure everything out, the pressure to find meaning in every experience, the pressure to close every chapter perfectly. Without this pressure, the mind becomes lighter. It no longer feels responsible for completing what life has left unfinished. It no longer feels the need to solve what cannot be solved. It begins to trust that life can continue even with open ends. This trust changes the way experiences are held. A person no longer clings to the past in the same way. They allow it to exist without trying to reshape it. They allow questions to remain unanswered. They allow emotions to rise and fall without forcing resolution. This creates a sense of freedom. because the mind is no longer trapped in the need for completion. It is free to move, free to experience what is here, free to let go. There is also a kind of humility in this, the recognition that not everything can be understood, that not every outcome can be controlled, that not every story will have a clear conclusion. This humility softens the mind. It reduces the need to grasp. It allows a deeper acceptance of life as it is. And in that acceptance, something becomes possible. The heart begins to rest, not because everything is finished, but because it no longer needs everything to be finished. This is a profound shift. It means that peace is no longer delayed. It is no longer something that comes after resolution. It is something that can exist alongside uncertainty, alongside incompleteness, alongside the unknown. This changes the way life is experienced. Moments are no longer evaluated based on whether they lead to clear outcomes. They are experienced for what they are, without the pressure to become something more. This creates a sense of presence, a deeper engagement with the moment, because the mind is not waiting for it to be complete. It is simply here. This presence brings a kind of fullness, even in the absence of resolution, because the moment is not being measured against an expectation. It is allowed to stand on its own. This is where quiet deepens, not because everything is clear, but because the need for clarity has softened. The mind is no longer chasing answers. It is no longer trying to close every loop. It is no longer holding on to what feels unfinished. It is allowing life to move as it does, allowing experiences to remain open, allowing the unknown to exist without fear. This does not remove all discomfort. There may still be moments of wondering, moments of wanting to understand, moments of wishing for closure, but these moments are seen. They are not followed blindly. They are allowed to pass, and in that passing, the mind remains steady. This steadiness is not rigid, it is flexible. It can hold uncertainty without collapsing. It can remain calm without needing resolution. It can stay present without needing everything to be complete. This is a different kind of strength, one that does not depend on certainty, one that does not require everything to be figured out, one that allows life to unfold without constant interference. This strength brings a quiet confidence, the confidence that the heart can handle what remains open, that it does not need to close every chapter in order to move forward, that it can carry unfinished moments without being weighed down by them. This confidence changes the way the future is approached. There is less fear of uncertainty, less need to control outcomes, less pressure to ensure that everything ends perfectly, because the mind has learned something important, that peace is not found in completion. It is found in acceptance, acceptance of what is finished, acceptance of what is unfinished, acceptance of what may never be resolved. This acceptance allows life to flow, without resistance, without the need to control, without the constant search for closure. And in that flow, something very simple becomes clear. Life does not need to be complete for the heart to be still. The moment does not need to be resolved for the mind to rest. Peace is not waiting at the end of everything. It is available in the middle of everything, right here, right now, even with open ends, even with unanswered questions, even with unfinished stories. And when this is truly seen, something shifts. The mind stops holding on, the heart softens, and a quiet, steady peace begins to settle in, not because everything is finished, but because nothing needs to be. As the mind begins to rest, even in the presence of unfinished things, a deeper layer quietly surfaces. Peace starts to feel possible without control, without perfect endings, without certainty. And yet, just as this softness appears, something inside resists again. Not loudly this time, but with a quiet fear. Letting go does not always feel like freedom at first. Sometimes it feels like losing something important. There is a subtle discomfort that arises when acceptance begins to take root. The mind may understand it, the heart may even sense the relief in it, but something deeper feels unsettled. It feels as if something is being taken away. And in a way, something is. Not something real, but something familiar. For a long time, the sense of self has been built around control, around managing outcomes, shaping experiences, holding things together, preventing loss, fixing what feels wrong. This effort becomes part of identity. I am the one who keeps things in order. I am the one who does not let things fall apart. I am the one who makes sure everything goes the right way. This identity feels strong. It feels necessary. It feels like safety. And when acceptance begins to loosen control, it can feel like that identity is being threatened. Because if there is nothing to control, then who am I? This question is often not spoken directly, but it is felt. When the mind is no longer trying to fix everything, no longer trying to resist every discomfort, no longer trying to shape every outcome, there is a space that opens. And that space can feel unfamiliar, it can feel empty, it can feel like something has been lost. This is why acceptance can feel like loss at first, not because something valuable is gone, but because something that felt essential is no longer being held. The identity built around control begins to loosen, and the mind does not always trust this immediately. It wonders, if I stop trying so hard, will everything fall apart? If I stop holding on, will I lose what matters? If I stop resisting, will I become weak? These fears are natural, because control has been associated with safety, with stability, with identity. But this association is not always accurate. Control often creates tension. It keeps the mind busy. It gives a sense of purpose, but also a constant pressure, the need to manage, to fix, to ensure, to prevent. And over time, this becomes exhausting, even if it feels necessary. When acceptance begins to replace control, that constant activity slows down. The mind is no longer pushing as hard. It is no longer holding everything together with effort. And this slowing can feel like something is missing, because the familiar sense of doing, of managing, of controlling, is no longer there in the same way. This is where confusion can arise. The mind may interpret this quiet as loss, as if something important has disappeared. But what has disappeared is not strength, it is strain. What has softened is not clarity, it is tension. What has loosened is not responsibility. It is the illusion that everything must be controlled in order to be okay. This distinction is important, because without it, the mind may return to old patterns. It may try to regain the sense of identity through control, to rebuild the familiar structure of managing everything, even if it creates suffering, because it feels known, and the unknown feels uncertain. This is why the process of acceptance requires patience. It is not just about understanding reality. It is about allowing identity to shift, to move from a sense of self based on control to a sense of self based on presence. This shift takes time, because identity is not just a set of ideas. It is something that is felt deeply, something that has been reinforced through years of habit, through repeated actions, repeated thoughts, repeated responses. And when those patterns begin to change, it can feel like the ground is shifting. But this shift is not instability, it is transformation. The person is not losing themselves. They are discovering a different way of being, one that does not depend on constant control, one that is not built on resistance, one that allows life to unfold without needing to manage every detail. This way of being is quieter, less forceful, less tense, and at first it can feel unfamiliar because it does not have the same intensity, the same urgency, the same sense of effort. But within this quiet, there is a different kind of strength, a strength that does not come from holding everything together, but from being able to remain steady even when things are not held. This strength is subtle. It does not announce itself. It does not push. It does not resist. It simply remains. Present, aware, open. This presence allows the person to experience life more directly, without the filter of constant control, without the need to shape every moment, without the pressure to maintain a certain identity. This creates a sense of ease, a naturalness, a feeling of being at home in the moment, even when things are uncertain, even when outcomes are not clear, even when change is happening. This ease is not something that can be forced. It arises when the need for control softens, when the identity built around control is no longer being reinforced. And this softening happens through awareness, through noticing the patterns, through seeing how often the mind tries to take control, through recognizing the tension that comes with it, and through gently allowing those patterns to relax. Not all at once, but gradually. Each time the mind notices the urge to control and chooses to pause instead, something shifts. Each time the moment is allowed to unfold without interference, something opens. Each time acceptance is chosen over resistance, the identity begins to change. This change may not be dramatic, it may not be visible from the outside, but internally it is profound. The person begins to feel less burdened, less responsible for everything, less pressured to maintain a certain image. They begin to feel more connected to the present, more at ease with what is happening, more able to respond without needing to control. This creates a sense of freedom, not the freedom to do anything, but the freedom from needing to do everything, the freedom from constant management, the freedom from the belief that everything depends on control. This freedom can feel strange at first, because it does not come with a clear identity. It does not say, "This is who you are." It simply allows the person to be, without needing to define themselves through action or control. This can feel like a loss, because the old identity is no longer as strong, but what is being lost is not the self. It is the tension that was mistaken for the self. And what is being found is something deeper, a sense of being that does not need to prove itself, that does not need to control everything, that does not need to resist reality in order to feel stable. This sense of being is quiet. It does not seek attention. It does not require validation. It simply exists. And in that existence, there is peace. A peace that is not dependent on outcomes. A peace that does not require control. A peace that remains even when things are uncertain. This peace is what acceptance makes possible, but it is only fully felt when the fear of losing identity is seen clearly. When it is understood that acceptance is not taking something away. It is revealing what was always there beneath the need for control, a natural steadiness, a quiet presence, a simple way of being that does not depend on managing everything. This understanding allows the process to continue, without fear, without resistance, with a gentle trust. Trust that letting go does not mean losing. Trust that surrender is not weakness. Trust that what is being released is not essential, and that what remains is more than enough. As this trust deepens, the feeling of loss begins to fade, and in its place something else appears, a sense of relief, a sense of lightness, a sense of no longer having to carry the weight of control. This is where acceptance becomes natural, not something to practice, but something that happens on its own. Because the need to resist has softened, the need to control has loosened, the identity built around effort has shifted, and what remains is simple. A mind that is present, a heart that is open, a life that is allowed to unfold, without constant interference, without the need to shape everything, without the pressure to maintain a certain form. And in that allowing, the mind becomes quiet again, not because it has lost something, but because it has finally stopped holding on. And in that release, there is a deep and lasting peace, one that does not feel like loss, but like coming home. As the weight of control begins to fall away and the sense of identity softens, Another hidden movement of the mind starts to become visible. It is not as obvious as resistance and not as direct as craving. It hides behind reasoning, behind hope, behind the quiet belief that things might still turn out differently. The mind is no longer fighting reality openly, but it is still trying to negotiate with it. There is a subtle conversation that happens inside, often without being noticed. It is not spoken out loud, yet it shapes the entire experience of the moment. It sounds like a quiet bargaining, a soft attempt to rearrange what is already happening. If this improves, then I will be okay. If this pain goes away soon, I can handle it. If they change, then everything will make sense again. If I do this differently, maybe the outcome will reverse. This is the trap of emotional negotiation. It is not as aggressive as resistance, but it carries the same tension. It is not as restless as craving, but it keeps the mind unsettled. It appears as a middle ground, something that feels reasonable, something that feels like coping. But underneath, it is still a refusal to fully meet reality. The mind is not saying no completely, but it is not saying yes either. It is waiting for a different version of the moment before it allows itself to rest. This creates a suspended state, a kind of emotional limbo. The person is neither fully present nor fully accepting. They are holding on to a possibility, a condition, a quiet hope that things will shift into something more comfortable. And as long as that hope is tied to peace, the mind cannot settle, because peace becomes dependent. It is placed in the future, it is postponed, it is delayed until something changes. This is how emotional negotiation keeps suffering alive, not through loud resistance, but through quiet postponement. The mind says, I will accept this, but only if it turns into something else. I will be calm, but only when this is resolved. I will be at peace, but only when this uncertainty ends. These conditions may seem harmless, but they create a constant background tension. Because life does not move according to these conditions. Pain does not always leave quickly. Change does not always come in the desired form. Endings do not always bring clarity. Uncertainty does not always resolve on time. And when these conditions are not met, the mind remains unsettled. It continues negotiating. It continues waiting. It continues holding on to the idea that something better is just around the corner. This waiting becomes a form of resistance, not against what is happening, but against the idea that what is happening might continue. The mind does not fully engage with the present because it is still oriented toward a different outcome. It is not here. It is somewhere ahead, anticipating, hoping, bargaining. This creates a sense of distance from the moment. The person feels disconnected, not fully present, not fully at ease. Even in stillness, there is movement. Even in silence, there is noise. Because the mind is not settled, it is still negotiating. This pattern can become deeply ingrained. A person may not even realize they are doing it. It feels like normal thinking, like planning, like coping. But beneath it, there is a constant tension, a refusal to let the moment be complete as it is. This tension can be seen in how the mind approaches discomfort. When something painful arises, the mind quickly tries to soften it through negotiation. It says, this is okay for now, but it needs to end soon. It tries to create a timeline for the pain, to make it temporary, to give itself a sense of control. But pain does not always follow a timeline. It moves on its own. And when it does not end as expected, the mind becomes frustrated, not only because the pain is there, but because the negotiation has failed. This adds another layer of suffering, the pain itself and the disappointment that it has not gone away. The same pattern appears with uncertainty. The mind tries to manage it by imagining possible outcomes. If this happens, then everything will be fine. If that happens, then I can relax. It builds scenarios. It prepares. it anticipates. But uncertainty does not resolve through thinking, and as long as the mind is trying to negotiate with it, it remains active. It keeps searching, keeps planning, keeps trying to find a way to settle. But settlement does not come from negotiation. It comes from acceptance. The moment the mind stops bargaining, something shifts. Not because the situation changes, but because the relationship to it changes. The person is no longer waiting for something else to happen before they allow themselves to be at peace. They begin to meet the moment directly, without conditions, without negotiation. This is where a deeper kind of acceptance begins. Not the acceptance that says, this is okay because it will change, but the acceptance that says, this is what is here, regardless of what happens next. This acceptance is not based on outcome. It is based on presence. It does not depend on improvement. It does not require resolution. It simply allows the moment to be experienced fully. This creates a different kind of stillness, a stillness that is not fragile, a stillness that does not depend on future change, a stillness that remains even in the presence of discomfort. This is where emotional negotiation begins to dissolve, not through force, but through understanding. The person begins to see how the mind has been trying to control the experience, indirectly, not by resisting, but by bargaining. And in that seeing, the pattern weakens. The mind no longer needs to create conditions for peace. It no longer needs to wait for something to change. It begins to trust the present, to see that peace is not something that arrives later. It is something that is available now, even in the middle of uncertainty, even in the presence of pain, even when things are not resolved. This trust changes everything because it removes the need for constant negotiation. The mind is no longer trying to shape reality through conditions. It is simply allowing reality to be as it is. This allowing creates space. Space for the experience to unfold, space for the body to relax, space for the mind to settle. There is no longer a need to hold on to possibilities, no longer a need to anticipate outcomes, no longer a need to create mental agreements with the future. There is only this moment, as it is. This moment becomes enough, not because it is perfect, but because it is not being resisted or negotiated. It is being lived. This is a different way of being, one that does not depend on control, one that does not rely on prediction, one that does not postpone peace. It allows the person to move through life with a sense of ease, not because everything is easy, but because the mind is not adding extra layers. It is not creating additional tension. It is not holding on to conditions. It is simply present. This presence brings clarity. The person can respond more naturally, without the distortion of expectation, without the pressure of outcome, without the need to negotiate. This creates a sense of freedom, a freedom from the constant need to manage experience, a freedom from the belief that peace must be earned through resolution, a freedom from the habit of waiting. This freedom is quiet. It does not draw attention to itself. It appears as a softening, a loosening, a gentle shift in how the moment is held. The person feels more grounded, more stable, more at ease, because they are no longer dividing their attention between what is and what should be. They are fully here. This does not mean that thoughts about the future disappear. It means they are no longer charged. They are no longer tied to emotional conditions. They are simply thoughts. They come and go without creating tension. This is where the mind begins to rest, not because everything is resolved, but because it is no longer trying to resolve everything. It is no longer negotiating with reality. It is allowing it. And in that allowing, something very simple becomes clear. The moment does not need to be different in order to be enough. It does not need to change in order to be accepted. It does not need to meet conditions in order to bring peace. It is already here, already complete, already enough. And when this is truly seen, the habit of negotiation begins to fall away. The mind becomes quiet, not because it has secured a better future, but because it has stopped waiting for one, and in that quiet there is a deep and steady peace, one that does not depend on outcomes, one that does not rely on conditions, one that remains even as life continues to change. And in that peace, the mind finally rests. As the mind begins to release its habit of negotiating with reality, a quieter layer starts to reveal itself. The struggle is no longer about changing the future or rewriting the past. It becomes something more immediate, more subtle, and often more constant. A quiet habit of judging what is happening right now, and without noticing it, the heart begins to carry a silent weight. There is a simple movement that happens inside the mind almost automatically. Something occurs, a feeling arises, a situation unfolds, and before the moment can fully be experienced, a label is placed on it. This is wrong. It happens so quickly that it feels natural. It feels like clarity, like understanding, like knowing what is good and what is not. But beneath this habit, something deeper is taking place. The moment is not just being seen, it is being resisted. Naming something as wrong is not always about truth. It is often about discomfort. It is the mind's way of pushing away what it does not want to feel. It creates a boundary between what is acceptable and what is not, between what should exist and what should not. And once that boundary is created, a conflict begins. Not outside, but inside. A person wakes up feeling tired, and the mind says, "This is wrong. I should feel better." A plan changes, and the thought appears, "This is wrong. Things should go as expected." Someone behaves differently, and the mind responds, "This is wrong. They should not act this way." These thoughts seem harmless, but they carry a hidden consequence. They turn the present moment into an opponent. Instead of simply experiencing what is happening, the mind begins to fight it. This fight does not always look dramatic. It can be quiet, subtle, almost invisible, but it creates tension. It creates a sense of pressure, a feeling that something needs to be fixed immediately before peace can return. And because life is full of small discomforts, small imperfections, small changes, this habit becomes constant. The mind is always correcting, always labeling, always deciding what is wrong. This creates a continuous disturbance, not because life is unbearable, but because the mind is not allowing it to be as it is. This is how ordinary difficulty turns into suffering. A simple inconvenience becomes a problem. A passing emotion becomes something that must be removed. A temporary situation becomes something that feels permanent, all because it has been labeled as wrong. This label carries weight. It does not just describe the moment, it shapes the experience of it. Once something is seen as wrong, the body reacts. The breath tightens, the muscles tense, the nervous system shifts into resistance. Even if the situation is small, the reaction becomes larger. This is not because the moment is intense, it is because the mind has turned it into something that should not exist. This creates a kind of internal war, not with other people, not with external circumstances, but with existence itself. Because reality does not always match preference, and if every mismatch is labeled as wrong, then every moment becomes a potential conflict. This is exhausting. Not because life is always difficult, but because the mind is constantly opposing it. There is a deeper pattern here. The mind believes that by labeling something as wrong, it is gaining control. It thinks that by rejecting the moment, it is protecting itself. But this is not what happens. What actually happens is that the mind becomes more reactive, more sensitive, more disturbed, because it is always scanning for what does not match its expectations. And since life rarely matches perfectly, the disturbance continues. There is always something to fix, always something to correct, always something to label as wrong. This creates a sense of instability, because peace becomes dependent on everything being right, and everything is rarely right in the way the mind defines it. This is where the heart becomes heavy, not from the events themselves, but from the constant judgment placed on them. The person is not just living their life, they are evaluating it, measuring it, correcting it, moment by moment. This creates distance from the present. Instead of being in the experience, the person is standing outside of it, deciding whether it is acceptable, and this distance creates a sense of disconnection, a feeling of not being fully here, of not being at ease, because the moment is not being allowed, it is being judged. This judgment can also turn inward, not just toward situations, but toward the self. A feeling arises and the mind says, "This is wrong, I should not feel this way." A mistake is made and the thought appears, "This is wrong, I should have done better." A weakness is noticed and the mind responds, "This is wrong, I should be stronger." This creates an internal conflict. Not only is the person fighting the moment, they are fighting themselves. This deepens the disturbance. Because there is no safe place to rest, the mind becomes both the judge and the one being judged, and this creates a constant tension, a feeling of never being enough, of always needing to be different, of never being allowed to simply be. Buddhist teaching offers a different way of seeing. It does not say that nothing is wrong in an absolute sense. It does not deny that harm exists, that injustice exists, that certain actions create suffering, but it points to something more immediate, the difference between seeing clearly and judging constantly. Seeing clearly means recognizing what is happening without adding resistance. It means understanding the situation without turning it into a personal battle. Judging constantly means labeling everything in a way that creates conflict. It turns observation into opposition. It turns awareness into resistance. This distinction changes the experience of life. When the mind begins to see without immediately labeling, something softens. A feeling arises, and instead of saying "this is wrong," the mind simply notices it. This is what is here. A situation unfolds, and instead of correcting it immediately, the mind observes it. This is what is happening. This simple shift removes a layer of tension, because the moment is no longer being pushed away. It is being allowed. This allowing does not mean agreement. It does not mean passivity. It means clarity. The person sees what is happening without distortion, without adding unnecessary resistance. This creates space. Space for the experience to unfold. Space for the body to relax. Space for the mind to remain steady. In this space, something changes. The moment becomes less heavy, not because it has changed, but because it is no longer being opposed. This is where quiet begins to return, not because everything is perfect, but because the mind is no longer turning every imperfection into a problem. This quiet allows a deeper understanding to emerge, that not everything needs to be labeled, not everything needs to be corrected, not everything needs to be judged. Some things simply need to be experienced. This experience becomes fuller, more direct, more alive, because it is not being filtered through constant evaluation. The person begins to feel more connected to the moment, more present, more at ease, even when things are not ideal. This is a different kind of peace, one that does not depend on everything being right, one that remains even when things are imperfect, because it is not based on judgment, it is based on acceptance. This acceptance does not remove difficulty, but it removes the extra layer of suffering created by labeling everything as wrong. This is where the heart becomes lighter, not because life becomes easier, but because the mind stops making it harder. It stops turning every challenge into a battle. It stops turning every discomfort into a problem. It stops turning every moment into something that must be fixed. This allows the person to move through life with more ease, more patience, more understanding. Because they are no longer fighting every experience, they are allowing it. This does not mean they stop responding. It means their response comes from clarity, not from reaction. They can still take action when needed. They can still set boundaries. They can still make changes. But they do so without the inner disturbance of constant judgment. This creates a sense of balance, a steadiness, a quiet strength. The mind is no longer thrown off by every small imperfection. It is no longer disturbed by every change. It is able to remain present. Even when things are not ideal, this presence becomes a foundation, one that supports the heart, one that allows peace to exist without conditions, because it is not dependent on everything being right. It is based on the absence of inner conflict. This is what happens when the habit of labeling everything as wrong begins to dissolve. The mind becomes quieter, the heart becomes lighter. The experience of life becomes more open, more direct, more real. And in that openness, something very simple becomes clear. The moment was never the enemy. It was only the judgment placed on it. And when that judgment softens, even slightly, the war ends, the mind rests, the heart settles, and life begins to feel less like something to fight and more like something to live. As the habit of judging every moment begins to soften, another place where the mind still struggles quietly comes into view. Even when the present is no longer being labeled as wrong, there is often one direction the mind keeps turning toward: backward. There is a quiet pull that returns again and again, not to what is happening now, but to what has already happened. And in that return, something inside keeps asking for a different version of what can never be changed. Some memories do not rest easily. They do not sit quietly in the past. They carry a certain weight, a feeling that something about them is not settled. And the mind, in its attempt to find relief, begins to revisit them, not gently, but with a quiet insistence. It goes back to the moment and begins to reshape it. This should have gone differently. I should have said something else. They should have acted in another way. That choice should not have been made. These thoughts do not stay as simple reflections. They become a kind of internal rewriting. The mind tries to adjust what has already occurred, not in reality, but in imagination. And for a brief moment, this can feel useful. It feels like learning, like understanding, like trying to correct something. But beneath it, something else is happening. The mind is refusing to accept that the past is complete. It keeps returning, not because the moment is still open, but because it has not been allowed to be what it was. This creates a subtle tension, a feeling that something is unfinished, that something needs to be corrected before peace can return. And so the mind continues. It revisits the same scenes, the same words, the same choices, again and again, as if repetition could create a different outcome. But the outcome does not change. The moment remains as it was. And the more the mind tries to rewrite it, the more exhausted it becomes. This is the quiet trap of needing a different past. It is not always dramatic. It can appear as simple regret, as quiet reflection, as thinking things through. But when it becomes repetitive, when it becomes a loop, it is no longer about understanding. It is about resistance. The mind is saying, this should not have happened, and because it cannot change what happened, it keeps trying to adjust it internally. This creates a kind of internal friction. The present moment is here, but the mind is not fully in it. Part of it is still in the past, trying to correct what cannot be corrected. This division creates unease. The person feels unsettled, not because the past is still happening, but because it is still being held. This holding becomes heavy over time, because the mind is carrying something that has already passed. It is not just remembering, it is resisting, and resistance requires energy. It keeps the nervous system active, it keeps the emotions engaged, it keeps the story alive. This is why some memories feel fresh, even after years, not because they are still present, but because they have never been allowed to rest. The mind has kept them moving, kept them active, kept them unresolved. There is a deep belief underneath this pattern that if the past were different, everything would feel better now. That if one moment had changed, the present would be lighter, easier, more complete. This belief creates a strong attachment to the idea of a different past. The mind begins to build alternative versions, imagined outcomes, different paths, better endings, and these imagined versions begin to compete with reality. The actual past feels wrong in comparison. It feels incomplete. It feels like something that needs to be fixed. But this comparison is the source of suffering, because the imagined past is not real, and the real past cannot become imagined. There is no bridge between them, only tension. This tension keeps the mind moving, keeps it returning, keeps it searching. But there is nothing to find, because the past is already complete. It does not need to be finished. It already is. This is a difficult truth to accept, not because it is complex, but because it requires letting go. Letting go of the idea that something can still be changed. Letting go of the belief that peace depends on a different version of what has already happened. Letting go of the habit of returning to the same moment with the hope of adjusting it. This letting go is not immediate. It happens gradually, through awareness, through noticing the pattern, through seeing how the mind keeps returning, and through recognizing that this return does not bring relief. It brings repetition. The moment this is seen clearly, something begins to shift. The mind pauses, not because it has found an answer, but because it begins to understand that the question itself is not leading anywhere. Why did this happen? What if I had done something else? These questions lose some of their urgency. They no longer feel necessary. They begin to fade, and in their place, something softer appears. Not an answer, but a different kind of response. Compassion. Instead of trying to fix the past, the mind begins to hold it gently. Instead of judging what happened, it begins to understand it, not to justify it, but to see it clearly. The person begins to recognize that they acted with the awareness they had at the time, that others behaved according to their own conditions, that life unfolded in a way that could not have been fully controlled. This recognition does not remove the memory, but it changes the relationship to it. The moment is no longer seen as something that must be corrected. It is seen as something that was experienced, and in that seeing, the tension begins to dissolve. The mind no longer needs to return to it in the same way. It can let it be. This does not mean forgetting. It means releasing the need to change what cannot be changed. Releasing the habit of replaying, releasing the belief that peace depends on a different past. This release creates space for the present moment, space for the mind to rest, space for the heart to soften. There is a kind of relief in this, not dramatic, not overwhelming, but quiet. A sense that something heavy has been set down, that the constant effort to adjust the past is no longer necessary. This relief allows the person to be more present, more available, more at ease, because they are no longer divided between what is and what was. They are here, fully. This presence changes everything. The person begins to experience life more directly, without the filter of past resistance, without the weight of unfinished stories, without the need to correct. This creates a different kind of freedom. Not the freedom to change what has happened, but the freedom from needing to. This freedom is subtle, but it is powerful. It allows the mind to move forward, not by leaving the past behind, but by no longer carrying it in the same way. The past becomes something that is included, not something that is held. It is part of the story, but not something that needs to be rewritten. This inclusion brings a sense of wholeness. The person does not need to reject parts of their experience. They do not need to hide from what happened. They can hold it all, with understanding, with compassion, with acceptance. This creates a deeper sense of peace, one that is not based on perfection, but on completeness. Not completeness of events, but completeness of acceptance. The moment is no longer divided into what should have been and what was. It is simply what was. And that is enough. This does not remove all emotion. There may still be sadness. There may still be regret. There may still be moments of remembering, but these emotions are no longer amplified by resistance. They are allowed to pass, to move, to settle, without being held in place by the need to change them. This allows healing to happen, not as a forced process, but as a natural unfolding. The mind becomes less reactive, less attached, less burdened. The heart becomes softer, more open, more at ease, because it is no longer fighting the past. It is no longer trying to rewrite it. It is allowing it. And in that allowing, something very simple becomes clear. The past does not need to be different for the present to be peaceful. The moment does not need to be corrected for the mind to rest. Everything that has happened has already found its place. And once that is seen, even for a moment, the need to return begins to fade. The mind grows quiet. Not because it has solved the past, but because it has stopped trying to. And in that quiet, there is a deep and steady freedom, one that does not depend on what could have been, but rests fully in what is. As the grip on the past begins to loosen and the mind no longer needs to rewrite what has already happened, a new space opens. There is less weight, less repetition, less resistance. And yet, even in this lighter state, something subtle remains, a quiet urge to hold things together. Even when the past is accepted, the mind still turns toward the future with a familiar instinct. It wants to shape it, secure it, protect it. It wants to make sure nothing unexpected disrupts this growing sense of peace. Because deep inside, something still feels unsafe without control. There is a silent assumption that runs beneath many thoughts and behaviors. It does not always speak in words, but it shapes how the body feels and how the mind reacts. If I stay in control, I will be okay. This belief is not always conscious. It lives in the nervous system. It shows itself in tension, in planning, in the need to anticipate outcomes, in the discomfort that arises when things feel uncertain. Control feels like protection. It gives a sense of direction, a feeling of influence, a belief that things can be managed in a way that avoids pain. When the mind can predict, organize, and adjust, it feels grounded. It feels prepared. And when that sense of control is threatened, something inside tightens, the breath becomes shallow, the body contracts, the mind begins to search for solutions. This reaction is not random, it is learned. From early experiences, the mind begins to associate safety with predictability. When things go as expected, there is comfort. When things change suddenly, there is discomfort. Over time, the nervous system builds a connection. Control equals safety. Uncertainty equals danger. This connection becomes deeply rooted. It shapes how a person moves through life. They begin to organize their world in ways that feel stable. They plan, they prepare, they manage. They try to reduce unpredictability as much as possible. This can be useful in many ways. It allows for structure. It helps in decision-making. It supports responsibility. But when control becomes the foundation of safety, it also creates tension, because life is not fully controllable. No matter how carefully things are planned, there will always be elements that are unpredictable. People will act in ways that cannot be fully anticipated. Situations will change. Outcomes will shift, and when these changes occur, the sense of safety is disrupted. Not because something harmful has happened, but because control has been challenged. This creates a feeling of instability. The mind begins to react. It tries to regain control, to fix, to adjust, to bring things back into a predictable pattern, and when it cannot, it becomes restless. This restlessness is not just mental, it is physical. The body feels it, the muscles tighten, the heart rate changes, the breath becomes uneven. This is the nervous system responding to perceived uncertainty. It is trying to protect, but it is protecting in a way that creates more tension, because it is based on the idea that safety depends on control. This is where a deeper understanding begins to emerge. Control feels safe, but it is not true safety. It is temporary stability. It depends on conditions. It requires constant effort. It is always at risk of being disrupted. True safety is different. It does not come from controlling everything. It comes from being able to remain steady even when things are not controlled. This is what Buddhist acceptance begins to teach, not by removing uncertainty, but by changing the relationship to it. Instead of trying to eliminate unpredictability, the mind begins to allow it. This does not happen instantly, because the nervous system is used to control. It feels familiar. It feels necessary. Letting go of control can feel uncomfortable at first, even threatening, because it removes the structure that has been used to create a sense of safety. This is where patience is needed, not forcing the mind to trust, but gently showing it that trust is possible, through small moments, small experiences of letting things be. A situation unfolds without intervention and nothing falls apart. A plan changes and the person adapts. An outcome is uncertain and the moment is still lived. These small experiences begin to shift the nervous system. It starts to learn that safety is not only found in control, it can also be found in presence, in the ability to meet what is happening without needing to shape it immediately. This is a different kind of strength. Not the strength of control, but the strength of openness. The strength to remain with uncertainty without collapsing. The strength to allow change without reacting instantly. The strength to trust the moment even when it is not predictable. This trust is not blind. It is not based on the belief that everything will go well. It is based on the understanding that whatever happens can be met, that the person is capable of responding, that they do not need to control everything in advance in order to be okay. This understanding brings a sense of calm, a quiet confidence. The mind no longer feels the need to manage every detail. It begins to relax, the body follows, the tension softens, the breath deepens, the nervous system settles. This settling does not come from certainty, it comes from acceptance, from allowing life to move as it does, without constant interference. This does not mean that planning disappears, or that responsibility is ignored. It means that these actions are no longer driven by fear. They are guided by clarity. The person can still prepare, but without tension. They can still act, but without needing to control the outcome. They can still care, but without attachment to a specific result. This creates a balanced way of living, one that includes action, but is not dependent on it. One that includes structure, but is not rigid. One that allows flexibility. This flexibility is important because it allows the person to adapt, to respond to change without resistance, to move with life instead of against it. This movement reduces stress because the mind is no longer trying to hold everything in place. It is allowing things to shift. This does not remove all discomfort. There will still be moments of uncertainty, moments where the future is unclear, moments where control feels tempting. But these moments are seen differently. They are not immediately labeled as dangerous. They are not automatically resisted. They are experienced. And in that experience, the mind begins to trust, not the situation but itself, its ability to remain present, its ability to respond, its ability to be with what is. This self-trust becomes the new foundation of safety, not control, not prediction, but presence. This presence is stable. Because it does not depend on conditions. It is always available, in every moment, regardless of what is happening. This changes the way the person experiences life. There is less fear of change, less need to control, less tension around uncertainty. Because the mind is no longer relying on control for safety, it is resting in awareness, in the ability to be. This rest is quiet. It does not need to be maintained through effort. It arises naturally when control softens, when the need to manage everything fades, when the mind allows life to unfold. This is where a deeper sense of peace appears, not the peace of perfect conditions, but the peace of inner stability. A stability that remains even when things are uncertain, even when outcomes are unknown, even when control is not possible. This peace is what acceptance makes possible, not by removing the challenges of life, but by changing how they are met. Instead of reacting with tension, the mind responds with openness. Instead of trying to control, it allows. Instead of resisting, it observes. This creates a different experience, one that is less driven by fear, less shaped by tension, more grounded in presence. This presence becomes a refuge, a place where the mind can return again and again, regardless of what is happening outside. This is the deeper form of safety, not built on control, but on awareness, not dependent on predictability, but rooted in trust. And as this trust grows, the need for control continues to fade, not because control is wrong, but because it is no longer necessary for peace. The mind becomes quieter, the body becomes lighter, the experience of life becomes more fluid, more open, more at ease. And in that ease, something very simple becomes clear. Safety was never found in controlling everything. It was found in learning to be with anything. And once that is understood, even slightly, the mind begins to rest, not because everything is certain, but because it no longer needs certainty to feel safe. And in that rest, there is a quiet, steady peace, one that remains, even as life continues to change. As the need for control begins to soften and a deeper sense of trust starts to take its place, another quiet struggle becomes visible. It is no longer about managing outcomes or holding the future in place. It becomes something closer, more personal, and often more painful. The struggle to manage people. Even when the mind begins to accept uncertainty, it still holds on to expectations about others, how they should act, how they should respond, how they should feel, how they should treat you. And when those expectations are not met, something inside tightens again. Not because people are wrong, but because they are not who the mind expected them to be. There is a silent tension that forms when the image of a person does not match their reality. The mind creates a version of who someone should be, based on hope, memory, desire, or need. It builds a quiet story around them. They should understand me. They should be more supportive. They should act differently. They should not change. This image feels real. It feels justified. It feels like a natural way to relate to others. But it carries a hidden weight, because the real person is not that image. They are changing. They are shaped by their own thoughts, their own emotions, their own experiences. They move in ways that cannot be fully predicted or controlled. And when this movement does not match the expectation, the mind reacts. It feels disappointed. It feels frustrated. It feels hurt. Not only because of what the person did, but because they did not fit the role that was created for them. This is where an inner conflict begins, not just with the person, but with reality itself. The mind tries to adjust them. It tries to guide them, correct them, influence them, sometimes gently, sometimes forcefully, but always with the same underlying intention to make them match the expectation. This effort creates tension, because people do not exist to fulfill internal images. They are not fixed. They are not designed to behave according to someone else's idea of who they should be. and when the mind tries to hold them in that shape, it creates resistance. This resistance can be subtle. It can appear as constant disappointment, as a quiet sense that something is always off, as a feeling that the relationship is not what it should be, or it can become more visible, as conflict, as arguments, as attempts to change the other person. But underneath all of it, the pattern is the same. The mind is not allowing the person to be as they are. It is trying to reshape them. This reshaping does not bring peace. It creates pressure. For both sides, the person being shaped feels it, even if it is not spoken. They feel the expectation, the silent demand to be different, and this creates distance, because no one can fully relax when they are being asked to be someone else. At the same time, the one holding the expectation feels tension. Because the reality never fully matches the image, there is always a gap, and that gap becomes the source of suffering. This is the inner war, not between two people, but between expectation and reality. And as long as that war continues, there is no rest. Because the mind is constantly adjusting, correcting, reacting, it is never simply allowing. This is where a deeper understanding begins to unfold. The realization that peace in relationships does not come from others changing. It comes from allowing them to be. This does not mean accepting harmful behavior. It does not mean ignoring boundaries. It means seeing clearly, seeing the person as they are, not as they should be. This seeing removes distortion. The mind no longer projects an image onto them. It no longer compares them to an expectation. It simply observes. This is who they are in this moment. This clarity brings a different kind of understanding. The person is no longer a problem to fix. They are a reality to relate to. This changes everything. Because once the person is seen clearly, response becomes possible, not reaction. Response. The difference is subtle, but important. Reaction comes from expectation. It says you should be different. Response comes from clarity. It says, this is who you are, and this is how I will meet that. This allows for healthier movement. The person can set boundaries if needed. They can communicate honestly. They can choose how to engage. But none of this comes from trying to change the other person. It comes from understanding them. This removes a great deal of tension. Because the mind is no longer trying to control something it cannot control. It is no longer invested in shaping someone else's identity. It is focused on its own presence. This presence creates space. Space for the relationship to breathe, space for the person to be themselves, space for interaction without constant pressure. This space allows something new to emerge. Acceptance, not passive acceptance, not resignation, but a quiet recognition. This is who they are. This does not mean agreement. It does not mean approval. It means clarity. And from that clarity, a deeper kind of connection becomes possible. Because the relationship is no longer based on illusion. It is based on reality. This reality may not always match preference. It may not always feel comfortable, but it is stable because it is not being constantly compared. This stability brings peace, not because everything is perfect, but because the mind is no longer fighting. There is also a deeper layer to this teaching. Often the expectations placed on others are not just about them. They are about the self. The mind looks for others to confirm something, to provide validation, to fill a certain role, to complete a certain feeling. And when they do not, it feels like something is missing. But this missing feeling is not caused by the other person. It is created by the expectation. The belief that someone else must be a certain way in order for the self to feel complete. This belief creates dependency. It places emotional weight on others, and when they do not carry it in the expected way, there is disappointment. This is where the shift becomes deeper. The person begins to see that their peace does not depend on others behaving a certain way. It depends on how they relate to what is. This removes pressure from the relationship. It allows others to exist without carrying the responsibility of fulfilling internal expectations, and it allows the self to remain stable even when others change, even when they act differently, even when they do not meet the imagined role. This stability is freeing. It allows relationships to be more honest, more real, more open, because they are no longer shaped by constant expectation. They are allowed to unfold naturally. This does not mean that all relationships remain. Some may change, some may end, but these changes are not driven by resistance. They are guided by clarity. The person sees what is present and responds accordingly, without trying to force something that is not there. This creates a different kind of connection, one that is not based on control, but on understanding, one that allows both people to be themselves, without pressure, without distortion. This connection is lighter, more flexible, more genuine, because it is not built on an image, it is built on reality. And in that reality, there is space. Space for growth, space for change, space for authenticity. This space brings peace, not because everything is smooth, but because the inner conflict has ended. The mind is no longer trying to reshape others. It is no longer holding on to expectations. It is allowing, and in that allowing, the heart softens. There is less frustration, less disappointment, less tension. There is more acceptance, more patience, more understanding. This does not make relationships perfect, but it makes them real. And in that reality, something very simple becomes clear. People are not here to match internal images. They are here as they are. And once that is seen, even slightly, the need to change them begins to fade. The inner war ends. The mind becomes quiet, not because others have become different, but because it no longer needs them to be. And in that quiet, there is a deep and steady peace, one that does not depend on others behaving a certain way, but rests in the simple act of allowing them to be who they are. And in that allowing, something opens. A kind of freedom, a kind of ease, a kind of connection that does not require control. And in that connection, the heart finally begins to rest. As the heart begins to rest in allowing others to be who they are, a deeper kind of quiet starts to form. There is less pressure, less expectation, less inner conflict. And yet, even in this softer state, there are still moments that hurt. Pain still arrives. But what happens next begins to matter more than the pain itself. There is a kind of suffering that is immediate and natural. It arises without asking for permission. A loss happens and sadness appears. A harsh word is spoken and the body tightens. Something ends and the heart feels it. This is the first layer. It is direct. It is real. It does not need to be explained. This is primary pain. It belongs to being human. It is not a mistake. It is not something to be avoided completely. It is simply the experience of life moving through the body and mind. But almost immediately, something else begins. A second layer forms. The mind starts to react to the pain. It comments, it judges, it resists, it builds a story around what is happening. This should not be happening. This is unfair. Why is this happening to me? This always happens. I cannot handle this. These thoughts begin to wrap around the original pain. And what was once a simple experience becomes something heavier. This is secondary suffering. It is not created by the event itself. It is created by the mind's reaction to the event. The pain is one thing, the resistance to the pain is another. And it is this resistance that multiplies the suffering. A person may feel sadness, and that sadness moves naturally. But when the mind says, "I should not feel this way," the sadness becomes a problem. It is no longer just a feeling. It becomes something that must be removed. And in trying to remove it, the mind creates tension. This tension adds another layer. The person is now not only feeling sadness, but also struggling against it. This struggle keeps the sadness in place. It prevents it from passing because it is being held. This is how suffering grows, not from the original experience, but from the way the mind relates to it. This can be seen in many situations. A person feels physical discomfort. The sensation itself may be manageable, but the mind reacts. This should not be happening. I need this to stop. What if it gets worse? These thoughts create anxiety, and the anxiety amplifies the discomfort. The body becomes more tense. The sensation feels stronger. The experience becomes more intense, not because the pain increased, but because the resistance added pressure. The same pattern appears with emotional pain. A feeling arises, and instead of allowing it, the mind begins to comment. It creates a narrative. It builds a story. It repeats the event. It adds meaning. It adds judgment. And all of this adds weight. The feeling is no longer simple. It is layered, complicated, heavy. This is what keeps suffering alive. Not the feeling itself, but the mental activity around it. The commentary, the resistance, the resentment. Each of these adds another layer. And over time, these layers become difficult to separate. The person no longer knows what is the original pain and what is the added suffering. It all feels the same, but they are not the same. One is natural, the other is created. This distinction is important because it shows where freedom is possible. Primary pain cannot always be avoided, but secondary suffering can be reduced. Not by removing pain, but by changing the relationship to it. This is where acceptance begins to play a crucial role. Acceptance does not remove pain. It removes the extra layer. It allows the experience to be felt without adding resistance. When the mind stops commenting, something shifts. The feeling is still there, but it is lighter. It is not being held in place by judgment. It is not being amplified by thought. It is simply being experienced. This allows it to move, to rise and fall, to pass naturally. This is the nature of all experiences. They are not fixed, they are not permanent, they move. But when the mind resists, it interrupts this movement. It keeps the experience in place. It holds it, and in holding it, it creates suffering. Acceptance releases this hold. It does not push the experience away. It does not try to change it. It simply allows it. This allowing creates space, space for the feeling to exist, space for it to move, space for it to pass. In this space, something becomes clear. The feeling is not the problem. The resistance is. When resistance drops even slightly, the experience changes. The body relaxes, the breath softens, the mind becomes quieter. The feeling becomes more manageable, not because it has changed, but because the extra weight is gone. This is a subtle but powerful shift. It changes how pain is experienced. Instead of being something that must be fought, it becomes something that can be felt. Instead of being a problem, it becomes a part of the moment. This does not mean that pain is welcomed. It means that it is not resisted. There is a difference. Welcoming may not feel natural, but allowing is possible. And in allowing, the experience becomes less intense. This is where compassion begins to arise, not as an idea, but as a natural response. The person begins to treat their own experience with care. Instead of pushing it away, they hold it gently. Instead of judging it, they understand it. This understanding softens the mind. It reduces the need to react. It reduces the need to fix. It creates a sense of ease, even in the presence of discomfort. This ease is not the absence of pain. It is the absence of resistance. This is what acceptance offers, not a life without difficulty, but a way of being with difficulty that does not create additional suffering. This changes everything because it removes the fear of pain. The person no longer needs to avoid every uncomfortable experience. They know they can meet it without being overwhelmed, without adding extra layers, without turning it into something larger than it is. This creates a sense of confidence, a quiet trust. The trust that whatever arises can be experienced without resistance. This trust reduces anxiety because the mind is no longer trying to control everything in advance. It is no longer trying to prevent pain. It is allowing life to unfold, and in that allowing, it remains steady. This steadiness is not rigid, it is flexible. It adapts, it moves, it responds without being disturbed. This is where true resilience begins, not from avoiding pain, but from not adding to it, from allowing it to pass through without interference. This resilience is quiet. It does not show itself loudly. It appears as calm, as presence, as the ability to remain grounded even when things are difficult. This grounding comes from acceptance, from the understanding that not every experience needs to be changed, that not every feeling needs to be removed, that not every moment needs to be corrected. Some things simply need to be felt, and in that feeling they move, they pass, they resolve themselves. This is the natural process, but it can only happen when the mind steps back, when it stops interfering, when it stops adding commentary, when it stops resisting. This is not always easy. The habit of reacting is strong. The mind is used to commenting, judging, resisting. But with awareness, this habit begins to weaken. Each time the mind notices its reaction and chooses to allow instead, something shifts. Each time resistance is seen and released, even slightly, the experience changes. Over time, this becomes more natural. The mind becomes less reactive, less attached to its commentary, more present, more at ease. This ease is not dependent on conditions. It is not something that comes and goes with circumstances. It is a way of relating to experience, one that does not create extra suffering. This is where the mind becomes quiet, not because there is no pain, but because there is no added resistance. The experience is simple, direct, uncomplicated. And in that simplicity, there is peace. A peace that does not come from changing the world, but from changing how the mind meets it. And in that meeting, something very clear becomes visible. Pain is part of life, but suffering does not have to be. And when this is understood, even for a moment, the mind begins to rest. Not because everything is perfect, but because it is no longer adding to what is already there. And in that rest, there is a deep and lasting calm, one that remains even in the presence of difficulty. Because it is not built on avoiding pain, it is built on not resisting it. And in that understanding, the heart becomes lighter, the mind becomes quieter, and life begins to feel less like something to endure, and more like something to experience. As the layers of unnecessary suffering begin to fall away, something unexpected starts to appear. The mind is no longer reacting as strongly, no longer adding as much resistance, no longer turning every feeling into a problem that must be solved. And yet, even in this quieter state, there is still a subtle effort that continues. A quiet attempt to manage everything, to adjust each moment, to supervise how life unfolds. And until that effort is seen clearly, the mind cannot fully rest. There is a hidden habit that lives beneath many thoughts and actions. It does not always feel like struggle. Sometimes it feels responsible, careful, even wise. But underneath, it carries tension, the need to correct life as it happens. Something arises and the mind immediately begins to adjust it. A feeling appears and the mind tries to shift it. A situation unfolds and the mind evaluates whether it needs to be changed, improved, or redirected. This habit is so constant that it often goes unnoticed. The mind is always doing something, always checking, always guiding, always making small corrections. It does not trust the moment to unfold on its own. It believes it must be involved in every detail, and this creates a quiet pressure, a sense that something must always be managed. Even in moments that are calm, the mind looks for what needs to be improved. Even in silence, it searches for something to adjust. This constant activity prevents rest, not because the mind is incapable of resting, but because it does not allow itself to. It believes that rest will lead to disorder, that if it stops correcting, something will go wrong. This belief keeps it active, keeps it engaged, keeps it alert. But this alertness is not peaceful. It is tense, it is vigilant, it is always ready to respond. And over time, this readiness becomes exhaustion. Not physical exhaustion, but mental fatigue, a feeling of never being fully at ease, of always having something to do, even when there is nothing urgent. This is the cost of trying to supervise life. The mind becomes responsible for everything, not in reality, but in perception. It takes on the role of manager, of controller, of fixer, and in doing so, it carries a burden that was never necessary. Because life is not something that needs to be constantly corrected. It is something that unfolds on its own, according to its own movement. This does not mean that action is not needed. It means that not everything requires intervention. Not every feeling needs to be changed. Not every situation needs to be improved immediately. Not every moment needs to be guided. Some things can be allowed. This allowing is not passive. It is aware, it is intentional, it is the recognition that the moment can exist without being corrected. This recognition creates space for the mind to pause, to step back, to observe without interfering, and in that space, something begins to change. The constant activity slows, the pressure softens, the mind begins to breathe. This breath is not just physical, it is mental. It is the release of tension, the absence of urgency, the feeling that nothing needs to be fixed right now. This is where rest begins, not as an action, but as a natural state. A state that was always available, but covered by constant correction. When the mind stops trying to adjust everything, it discovers that it does not need to, that many things resolve on their own, that feelings move naturally, that situations shift without force, that life continues even without constant supervision. This realization is quiet but powerful. It removes a layer of responsibility, a layer that was never real. The mind begins to trust the process of life, not as an idea, but as an experience. It sees that not everything falls apart when it steps back, that not every moment needs guidance, that presence is often enough. This trust creates a different kind of engagement. The person is still involved in life, still aware, still responsive, but not controlling, not correcting, not supervising every detail. This changes the quality of experience. There is less tension, less urgency, less need to manage. There is more openness, more ease, more flow. The person begins to move with life instead of against it. This movement is natural. It does not require effort. It does not create strain. It allows things to unfold. This does not mean that everything becomes perfect. It means that the need for perfection fades. The mind no longer insists that everything must be a certain way. It allows variation. It allows change. It allows imperfection. This allowance brings a sense of relief, because the mind is no longer trying to hold everything in place. It is no longer carrying the responsibility of making life right. It is simply present. This presence is enough. It allows the person to respond when needed, to act when appropriate, but without the constant pressure of correction. This creates a different kind of clarity. The person sees more clearly because they are not distracted by constant adjustment. They can recognize what truly needs attention and what can be left alone. This discernment is important, because not everything requires action. Some things simply need to be experienced. And when they are, they move, they resolve, they pass. This is the natural flow of life. But it can only be seen when the mind stops interfering, when it stops trying to guide every moment, when it allows the process to unfold. This is where rest deepens, not just as a moment of relaxation, but as a way of being. The mind is no longer tense, no longer alert in a reactive way. It is calm, steady, open. This openness allows for a different experience of life. One that is less controlled, less structured, more fluid. This fluidity brings a sense of freedom. Not the freedom to do anything, but the freedom from needing to control everything. This freedom is quiet. It does not draw attention. It appears as ease, as softness, as a gentle presence. The person begins to feel more connected to the moment, more grounded, more at peace, because they are no longer trying to correct what is happening. They are allowing it. This allowing does not remove responsibility. It refines it. It shows what truly needs attention and what does not. It removes unnecessary effort. It reduces strain. It creates balance. This balance is sustainable. It does not lead to exhaustion. It supports the mind. It supports the body. It allows energy to be used where it matters and released where it does not. This is where the mind begins to breathe fully, not in short, tense breaths, but in deep, steady ones, a reflection of its internal state, calm, relaxed, at ease. This ease is not dependent on circumstances. It does not require everything to go well. It does not depend on perfect conditions. It comes from the absence of constant correction, from the willingness to let life be. This willingness changes everything. The person is no longer fighting the moment, no longer trying to shape it, no longer supervising it. They are living it, fully, presently, without resistance. This creates a sense of completeness, not because everything is finished, but because nothing is being rejected. The moment is whole, as it is. This wholeness brings peace, a deep, quiet peace, one that does not need to be maintained, one that arises naturally when the mind steps back and allows life to unfold. This is the rest that comes, not from doing less, but from being less involved in unnecessary correction, from trusting what is, from allowing what is, from no longer needing to fix every detail. And in that rest, something very simple becomes clear. Life was never meant to be controlled in every moment. It was meant to be experienced. And once the mind understands this, even slightly, it begins to relax. It begins to let go. It begins to breathe. And in that breath, there is a quiet, steady peace. One that remains even as life continues to move, because it is not built on control. It is built on acceptance. And in that acceptance, the mind finally rests. Something inside you has started to shift. Not because life suddenly became easier, but because you are no longer fighting it the same way. You have seen how resistance multiplies pain, how control creates tension, how judgment turns simple moments into silent battles. And more importantly, you have seen something deeper. Peace was never hiding in a perfect life. It was waiting in your willingness to let life be. When you stop arguing with reality, the mind stops shouting. When you stop needing everything to be different, the heart begins to rest. When you stop trying to rewrite the past, control the future, or reshape people, something quiet opens up within you. A space where nothing needs to be fixed. A space where you can finally breathe. This is not weakness. This is clarity. This is the kind of strength that does not break under pressure, because it is no longer resisting what is already here. And the truth is, this is just the beginning. If this message reached you, if something in you felt seen, write in the comments, "I allow life." Let it be your reminder. Let it be your commitment. And if you are ready to go deeper into this kind of wisdom, to train your mind to stay calm, clear, and unshaken no matter what life brings, then subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Because the more you understand this, the quieter your mind becomes, and in that quiet, your real life begins.